Cause you're listening to Jams and Tea, you won't see the show on your TV, so we talk about things musically. Cause you're listening to Jams and Tea, you're listening to Jams and Tea.
Hello everyone and welcome to a brand new episode of Jams Tea Podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And today we are going to be talking about not one, not two, but three new releases. Not just the normal two. We're going to be talking about three new albums today. We are going to be talking about the latest album from Xiu Xiu. We are going to be talking about Oh No. We are going to be talking about the most recent Death from Above 1979 album, which is called what the fucking shit was that again?
Is for lovers.
Is for lovers, but with like a four. So you know,
because it's their fourth album. Jokes.
Get it? And also, we're going to be talking about the new Antlers album, Green into Gold. We have done an episode where we covered the entire discography of the Antlers with our friend Zach, who is also here today with us. Oh my God.
Right there.
Also, two things. One, Record Club this week is going to be on Brockhampton's Ginger, because the new Brockhampton album comes out next week. We're going to be covering that. That's the only release from that band that we have not covered, so go check that out after you're done listening to this. It will be out afterwards. And second of all, I just wrote a new book and it's out right now. Woohoo! Links in the description.
Yes. And I feel we should also shout out for a couple. I've got a couple of things. Yes, I was going to get to that. First thing I was going to say is that long-time fans may notice that the great August is not with us this week. Never fear, he shall return.
Yes, I killed him.
And yes, also want to shout out the fact that very significant day for a friend of the podcast, Laura, who has just released on we're recording on Bandcamp Friday. This will be going out on Sunday, but either way, now available is a absolutely stacked compilation of songs from a variety of different artists that Laura that we're all big fans of, and that also deserve some attention that aren't quite necessarily given them. Including our very own Saoirse. And the point of this compilation is that the proceeds from this compilation, which you can purchase on Bandcamp, are going towards the trans youth charity Mermaids. So I believe Laura has already raised over £1,300 already, which is a great amount of money considering it has just been released. She has been promoting this comp ridiculously heavily for the last month. And now that it's out, we want to make sure that we raise as much money as possible. So please, we'll make sure that there's a Bandcamp link in the description of this video. Please go and check out the compilation. Please give whatever you can contribute to it. Money will be going to a great cause, and you'll be getting, I'm pretty sure there's at least 30 songs on this thing.
It's huge.
From artists such as Everything, King Gizzard, the Lizard Wizard, and Xiu Xiu, who of course we are reviewing today. So go and check that out. It is more than worth whatever also, you're able to spare.
A member of Black Midi, I think, has a solo song on it.
Yeah, so lots of big names and lots of other names who you may not have heard of, but are getting some deserved attention as well. So go check that out right now. And your contributions will mean a lot to a lot of people. Okay, let's kick in, as we always do on every main episode, with a roundtable discussion of what we've been listening to in the past 7 days. We go in our regular acronym order, Jams and Tea. And obviously Zach will have the opportunity to contribute anything he wants to share about what he's been listening to or what his thoughts are on any of the albums we discuss before we get into the reviews proper as well. So buckle in. Jake, what have you been listening to this week that we're not already reviewing?
Yeah, definitely going to be a talking point of yours as well, but Tyler and I have been steadfastly making our way through the discography of mathcore band The Dillinger Escape Plan, because for some fucking reason I only just now started listening to them in any serious capacity because of Morgan's, I believe in one of these very segments, shouting out their first album, Calculating Infinity, and his rapturous praise of that. So I was like, well, I clearly need to sit down and listen to that shit. And I listen, and also he talked about their collaborative EP with Mike Patton, Irony is a Dead Scene, which I also listened to.
Just last week, that was.
And I'm just going to count this as one particular segment because literally every single Dillinger Escape Plan album I've listened to, which is all of them now, rip. All of them are great. Notably, my favorite thus far, I still want them to like grow with me a little bit just because they're all of similar quality, is One of Us is the Killer, which I just think is unbelievably hard, and it just like mixes all of their most interesting elements in a way that I find the most appealing. It's got some of my favorite songs by them. They're fucking, the intro and outro are like the best intro and outro that they have thus far, and it's just like you really can't go wrong with that band. Like even my least favorite album of theirs is like great, and it's also like kind of weird, so I can see other people kind of sticking to it, as Tyler I think did, because I wasn't like an enormous rabid fan of Ironworks, but you were like really up, you were really into that. So
I'll shout it. I'll speak on that record when it's my segment.
Yeah, can't go wrong with them. If you like hardcore shit and if you like mathcore, or just like you want to have fun and also get the shit kicked out of you musically for like a solid 40 to 50 minutes, can't go wrong. Every single album is great. Also just, I can't fucking believe that they got Mike Patton on an EP and then covered Aphex Twin. Like what a fucking galaxy brain fucking idea. I love them for that.
I think what's the most impressive about
B-sides when.
Yeah, well, that will have to happen at some point. What's most impressive about Dillinger Escape Plan to me is that you can listen to that Mike Patton EP, and then you can go to a record like Miss Machine, which was the next record they made after it, and they have the same energy, despite the fact that only one of them has Mike Patton on it. And that's a testament to the fact that the band don't necessarily need to have a legendary lunatic like him to capture the same kind of vibe.
I'd argue the lead singer becomes his own legendary lunatic.
I would. It's Greg Puciato is his own flavor.
Dude just comes on a track sounding like Devin Townsend in the Strapping Young Lad era, and I'm just like, yes, King, go off. And in that respect, I also revisited another hardcore favorite of mine, which is my favorite Converge album, which is You Fail Me, specifically the Redux remastered version of that, which the original is, of course, a very great album, but the new one just, it's got a fuller sound and it kicks more, and god damn, I never get tired
blessed
of that
record.
It's
a blessed record.
Fucking insane. Like, I know it's highly rated and well regarded, but because of its proximity to Jane Doe, I feel like it's just sort of an album that not as many people talk about. And it's a shame because, oh my god, it's got songs on there that just absolutely, like, that stretch of like the first like 5 or 6 songs is like the hardest shit I've ever heard in my life. And then it has like some songs like later that are distinctly softer. And then it has songs like Eagles Becoming Vultures, which is probably my favorite Converge song, which just destroys. There are some days where I feel like I might prefer All We Love We Leave Behind. Or not All We Love We Leave Behind, The Dusk in Us, which is an unpopular take, but I do love that album. But nah, it's You Fail Me all the way. Love that record. Oh, this is perfect because Zach is here. I listened to my second Liars album. I did Drums Not Dead before, and now I did Mess. And that album I've actually spun 3 times since I've heard it initially, just because it's got this groove and it gets under your skin in like the best way possible. And it's so like, I've not felt like I've been compelled to dance this much in like years. Like, it's such a weird dance punky thing. It reminds me of like 80 other things that I like. It's so weird and singular, but it just knocks. And then it's got like weird IDM shit in the back half of it. And it's just good. It's just real good. Nothing insightful I can say about it other than it's just a lot of fun to listen to. I gave a re-listen to an album that I've just like, for whatever reason, like I heard it initially, like I love this and I need to like listen to it more to unlock it, because I was just like, I feel like I'm going to give this album a 10. Lo and behold, I did, and that record is in the vein of pleasing people on this podcast. That is Nujabes' Modal Soul. It's just the best fucking thing I've ever heard. Like, I listened to it and I was just like, it's amazing how every piece of production on this is the best thing I've ever heard in my life ever. Just all of it. It's perfect.
greatest hip hop album of all time.
I mean,
I think it's
Nujabes has a sort of Portishead track record where not only is everything that he has ever done excellent, every single record you're like, is this the best record in the genre? Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty impressive.
And I haven't even listened to the, I've only listened to Metaphorical Music and Modal Soul, which both of them I love with all my heart and soul. Yeah, it's fucking terrific. Please listen to it. Those records are albums that I do not see talked about nearly as much as they should be. To give a taste for something we will be covering eventually, but like much, much later down the line, is I gave a first sit down listen to an album I put on the docket for Record Club, which is Linkin Park's Meteora. And I'll go into, like, I'm sure we all will, with like that band and just everything about it, but like, I wanted to do it more as an exercise in theory. Like, I didn't know how I'd feel about the album, but I just wanted to be like, I'll take like the album that I think is going to be the best from them and like so center a discussion around it, because there's a lot to say. And I didn't expect for it to just go. Like, the whole album just rules. Like, it's got problems, and it's kind of like, it's a little edgy and like a little like, and I'm just not totally sold on Mr. Mike Shinoda on most of those, with one notable exception, which absolutely fucking rips. But that album just kicks ass. There's no like bad songs on it, and it's just kind of like, yeah, it's hard.
It's just the best and really only way to describe it is that it is a Linkin Park album. It sounds like a Linkin Park album. It is just the best version of that could possibly exist.
Last on my list here, I will talk about an album just because I've been freebasing shoegaze for around a year now. I let me take a look at my fucking scrobbles here.
This is your brain on shoegaze.
my most scrobbled album of all time is,
you might say.
I like that. Yeah. My most scrabbled album of all time is Souvlaki Remastered with 2,656 scrabbles. And Brockhampton's Ginger with 1,800. So, haha, tie-in. But I was just like, I need more shoegaze. And Tyler, at some point, I don't remember when exactly, was just like, you need to check out the band Ride. And I was like, sure, okay, let's do this shit. And I listened to Nowhere. And surprise, surprise, Tyler's recommendation of shoegaze music's really, really good. What? No, never would have predicted this.
I mean, like, it's just one of those albums that's universally beloved, and I felt that I needed to pass it on to you because I knew there's no way in hell you wouldn't love it.
Yeah, I definitely do. It's fantastic, and I really want to check out their other stuff and it again. This is a Jake complaint, is that like, some albums just do be kind of long. That's one of them. I would have preferred if it was like, I feel like maybe Slow Dive have just maybe teased me a bit much. Oh Jesus,
I'm a man of my word.
I'm pretty sure the Ride album is like slightly over an hour, and it's like the 40 to 45 minute range is the sweet spot for me with this sound. So
there's a reason that all those like Slow Dive EPs hit like they do.
Yeah,
and it's because they're short and sweet, and they just like create a texture and a mood. There's a reason I love the shouts to the Antlers podcast that we did. There's a reason I love Undersea. Like, it's
what's the fucking,
put it in the
Outside Your Room, is that what it's called?
Yes.
One of the Slow Dive EPs. Yeah, that one's fucking amazing. But
Jake, I have some news for you that you may not have been aware of. I suspect this is what's happened because it's happened before. The Ride album.
Is this going to be like the Bauhaus album?
I don't know what the Bauhaus album situation is, but the Ride album is actually only 38 minutes long, and you've probably been listening.
Son of a bitch!
You always got to check rate your music every single time.
Probably been listening to bonus tracks without knowing they're bonus tracks.
Oh, stop doing this, Apple Music! You're fucking killing me.
The reason this is important is not just so you understand what the album is, but also because the Ride album ends with one of my favorite closing tracks of all time, which is Vapor Trail.
It's such a good song. It's like exactly where I would have picked to end the album.
That's where the album ends, and it's my favorite, my favorite shoegaze song ever.
I'm literally going to like listen to it again like right after this and just be like, I'm probably gonna hit this with a 10 now. But like,
it's because as soon as you see it, because I haven't listened to this album in full in a while, so it's when you see like it's a little too long. It took me a second to kind of register what you were saying. I was like, and there's like, really?
Like Bauhaus is in the Flatfields did the same thing to me. I was just like, yeah, this has a lot of problems where like I have a lot of there are still a lot of post-punk albums that I do think continue on. Like I love The Cure's Disintegration, but like also it's just really long. But I was just kind of like, this album was too long.
Watch your profanity.
It's one of my favorite albums. Shut the fuck up. But it was just like, no, the album's like 40 minutes.
The Cure album, Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me. I'm like,
yeah, that's the one.
That's a better example of that.
Yeah, I was gonna say like that is an album that's like it doesn't have the highs of Disintegration, and it's like a little longer, but like it's still excellent. But like it's long.
Jake, some albums are too long. Also, Jake, Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness is my favorite Smashing Pumpkins record. It's okay. Me too, baby. It's fine.
Look.
The heart wants what it wants.
Or even just Wish being your favorite Cure album.
Yeah, that's that too.
Which is like
the Seer being your favorite Swans album. Well, also
I'm a walking contradiction. That's me.
It's fine. It's fine.
All right, I guess that's me then. The big thing that I got through this week is the discography of atmospheric black metal band Agalock and Sweet Baby Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, and all his carpenter friends. Wow. That's a band.
That's a Godspeed You Black Emperor album title.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. You know what? Maybe they made some points. Just like Ashes Against the Grain alone, this is like the best black metal band ever. And then they have, let's count them, 1, 2, 3 records and an EP, all of which are just pretty much just as good.
Seeing everyone love the White EP has been the most gratifying thing ever for me. Oh God, yes.
In preparation for what we're listening to this week, I listened to my first Antlers album, which was, I couldn't remember which ones you recommended to me. So I asked for both a recommendation for the Antlers and Xiu Xiu, and I couldn't remember either one that you recommended. So I listened to Burst Apart by the Antlers and listened to Nothing by Xiu Xiu.
Burst Apart might have been the worst place to start with the Antlers, if I'm being honest.
It was fine. Other thing I gave a re-listen to was Slint's Spiderland, which I think I mentioned on here that I listened to for the first time in this segment not too long ago. Yeah, that's just perfect album.
Correct. So true.
You can't argue with it. I was trying to think of my favorite song on it, and I was like, okay, but it could be Washer, or it could be The Dam. I can't remember names. Hang on.
Dawn, a Man.
Nosferatu Man. It could be fucking Breadcrumb Trail. Yeah.
That album for me is like the peak of like 3 genres simultaneously. And really foundational to just every sound that I like that happened after 1991, more or less.
Kentucky pulling through.
Yeah. Did I listen to anything else? No, I didn't.
Something we might as well shout out is that Spiderland actually had its 30th birthday this week.
Oh.
I think about 6 or 7 days ago.
Serendipity.
Yeah, something like that.
Dippity doo-dah.
Dippity yay. But no, so one thing I listened to this week, I didn't get a chance to listen to a whole lot because my Wi-Fi was a bitch. But I set a record this week between listening to an album in full for the first time. I knew loads of the songs really well, but I set a record between listening to it in full for the first time and owning it on vinyl. And that is The Greatest Generation by the Wonder Years.
Yeah.
Yep.
Which I've had the good fortune of seeing the Wonder Years live, supported by Pup, actually.
Fuck.
Damn, fuck you.
That's me to any of you anytime you talk about a show you've been to.
I feel like I must be catching that a lot then, huh?
Mhm.
Sorry.
No, I like to live vicariously through you all. Don't worry.
I'm glad to hear.
I'll FaceTime with you the next time I go to one, whenever the world is ending.
Fantastic.
I think that would just make it worse, Zach, but I appreciate the thought.
Yeah, it's like when they have those Zoom concerts that they've had for the past year. It's just like
I saw Code Orange one of those, and they went fucking hard.
Well, yeah, Code Orange only has one mode, and that is burn your goddamn house down. But it's just I'm happy to be supporting an artist, but they're just sitting there, and like every now and then you get the in between songs where you get all of the audience in Zoom clapping, and it makes me want to fucking kill myself. It's just the most depressing thing imaginable.
I'm looking at the Rate Your Music page for this album that Saoirse's about to talk about, and it's a pop punk record with a 3.61 rating on Rate Your Music, which tells me it's probably
unheard of.
It's probably one of the greatest albums ever made.
Yeah, you'd be right about that.
And it's probably the third best Wonder Years album.
That's a hot ass take. This is widely considered to be their best, although I will 100% go to bat for No Closer to Heaven and just say it's outright bad. But
yeah,
and I'll go to bat for Sister Cities too.
Well, No Closer to Heaven was the album they were supporting when I got to see them. But the thing is about this record is that it has one quiet track, and the rest of them just go, and they're all incredibly emotionally strong. And the last track is a literal victory lap, in the way that only the best albums can pull off, where the last track is like reprises of their best choruses across the record. And you have to have made an excellent record to pull that off. And it is one of the most satisfying moments in music for me.
Yeah, that closer's got a 4.4 on Rim, which is pretty.
Nelly.
That sounds about right.
Which is pretty high for a song.
Not even top 3 on that album for me. Like I would
agree with you. I think if I had to choose 3, I would definitely have Passing Through a Screen Door. The Devil in My Bloodstream just makes me cry. And probably Dismantling Summer. Those are the basic choices, but I love them.
Yeah, I mean, it's just fucking the front half of that album, that being the first 6 songs, is like it just here's a 10, here's another 10, here's a 10 after that, and etc.
Yep, you're not incorrect. That's exactly what it's like. In an uncharacteristic move, I listened to Beyonce's Lemonade this week.
Ooh.
Yeah, her best.
I would
agree.
Be inclined to agree.
Great album.
This is
it's secretly album. Because it's a Diplo and James Blake album, but that's fine.
Yeah.
It's not. Don't.
Production-wise, I mean, there's like 8 producers on that album. It's reductive to say that it's just those 2 guys, but the reason it's the reason it's so great is because it's got this really nice, diverse, like series of basically like mid 2010s hitters in terms of producers for her to sing over.
Like when you have I can't remember the names, but the album, the song samples Led Zeppelin, and the song that Put Your Fingers Up, Tell 'Em Boy Bye, to have both of those songs on a record that sound so different, and they both work cohesively.
It's because it's like fucking Beyonce. She can do that shit.
Yep. Freedom. What a fucking knocker.
I also want to go to bat, not that it's an underrated record, it's certainly not, but at least people talk about it now. But I want to go to bat for her self-titled record, which is which is really fucking good. Like I would say it's as good as Lemonade, and it's also more, I would even call it more fun than Lemonade, because Lemonade is a record that is fun, but it's also kind of like very serious, and it has this whole overarching thing. And I don't particularly find Beyonce interesting enough as a character to find the whole marriage thing compelling. Whereas Beyonce, the self-titled record, none of that shit even matters. It just fucking bops.
Yeah. You see, for me, like the whole marriage thing, for me, it forms a background of the record that sort of unlocks emotions that I find broadly accessible to many life experiences in it. Like, it's essentially like, okay, so this was a headspace in writing the record. This is now what I can get out of it that's separate to that, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to move on. Morgan listened to Spiderland. I listened to another spoken word record this week. If you want to consider Spiderland spoken word record, I guess. But anyway, King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard's second album, Eyes Like the Sky, which they've described as a rock audiobook. There's another sort of singer of a famous Australian band that I'm not familiar with that does all of the focus on this record and narrates this Wild West story of sort of revenge and blood and mysticism. And it's 28 minutes long. It is probably the most interesting of King Gizzard's middling records. But it is definitely interesting. And the way that you go from 12 Bar Brews, your debut, to this, it's just such a bold move. And I wanted to highlight that because it's an experiment to basically make your band play instrumentals and have someone else narrate a story over the top of it.
They do that with Murder of the Universe as well, and I broadly feel the same way that you do about the record you're talking about Murder of the Universe. Like, it's good and it's got some bops on there, but it's just like, like, this is interesting. It's a little bit more interesting in theory than in practice, but
my stance is this: if you're Australian and your name isn't Nicholas Cave, I do not want to hear you doing spoken word. Because
there's so many good spoken word albums though.
Australian. I'm talking about the Australian accent.
Oh, I see.
It's not an accent. It's not an accent that lends itself well to speaking.
What about the drones? They're not spoken word, but
I feel like this is deeply ingrained, internalized Kiwi racism.
Oh, it's 100% racism. But I also hate. But the thing is,
have that, Laura. Go on, Laura, clip that out of context.
Yes.
The reason it's okay is that I also hate the sound of New Zealand voices, specifically Northern New Zealand voices. And if you're hearing a New Zealand celebrity or a New Zealand voice and you're not a Kiwi, you're probably hearing someone from the North. I think their voices sound like shit. I don't like my voice, but I think at least it sounds better than that because it's not super high pitched and whiny. But
Tyler, I love your voice.
It's fine. Thank you.
It's a lovely voice.
I'm just going to close this up basically saying I took a deep dive into a genre I've been meaning to take a deep dive into, that being called murder folk, which is basically if you wanted Nick Cave murder ballads to sound like bluegrass and folk punk, this is probably for you.
It's probably for all three of you in the world.
And one of them is Saoirse.
Yeah, you're correct about that. But it sort of comes out of like folk punk, but includes like Southern Gothic and bluegrass and these incredibly dark stories. Like one of the albums I listened to, it's a compilation of EPs by this guy called Amigo the Devil, who I discovered has an album coming out in like a few weeks that I had no idea about. And this compilation, which is called Volume 1, sweet Jesus, is this incredible. I loved it so much. The storytelling is great. The instrumentation is great. There's like songs about Jeffrey Dahmer trying to find stardom in Hollywood and like murdering your alcoholic wife. And they're all just incredibly well written and
God damn, this guy looks exactly like you would imagine a guy named Amico the Devil who makes murder folk music. Motherfucker looks like a bluegrass Rasputin.
He looks like a country version of Post Malone.
Yeah.
In 5 years' time, all country stars will look like Post Malone.
What a terrifying future.
Maybe Post Malone can become a country star.
Wouldn't
Machine
not at all
Gun
out of
Kelly.
the question.
That would be good. I'd like that. I think he'd be better at it than Pop, to be frank. But anyway, I do hope to cover his new record coming out this month. And if we do, this is a great way to get what he's about.
What have I been listening to? Let me just get it up.
Mr. Dillinger?
Yes, I have been listening to the Dillinger Escape Plan copiously. And I want to shout out, I've actually only heard their first 3 albums. I still haven't gotten into the back half of their career yet, which I'm very excited to do. I'm going to do that over the next few days, probably. But my favorite from those first 3 is Miss Machine, which is just this really just front to back bangers.
Same.
Mathy as fuck.
Just this ridiculously wild record. Yeah, I absolutely adore it. But I want to shout out Ironworks because my hot take is that, and maybe this will change when I hear their last few records, but I actually think that Calculating Infinity is not as good as the stuff that came after it. And most of that is the fact that Greg Puciato is not on that album. They have a different vocalist on that record. And it's also just, it's an incredibly impressive record musically. Like I still give it an 8 out of 10. Incredibly impressive record musically. But it doesn't quite have the fun factor that their other albums have, for me anyway. And Ironworks is a really interesting record because yes, it is the least consistent of those 3 for sure, mainly because there's a stretch of shorter songs in the middle of the record that are very much all over the place, and I'm not in love with all of them, but they are pretty short, so it's not the end of the world. But I also think that Ironworks has the 2, and again, I've only heard the first 3 albums yet, but if anything overtakes these, I'll be stunned. Ironworks has the 2 best Dillinger Escape Plan tracks I've heard. The first is Black Bubblegum, which is just an incredible single. One of the most fun song in the discography so far, closely followed by Sunshine the Werewolf. But Black Bubblegum is just, it has one of the best choruses of all time. It's just so, I've played it in the car over and over and over this week. It's absolutely ridiculously fun song.
That's me with Prancer off of One of Us is the Killer, which I just throw on in the car and I'm like, ah! It's like I'm the Death Grips music video.
And I can't wait to get to that as well. But my favorite song on Ironworks and my favorite Dillinger Escape Plan song, and I was added by a mutual who gloriously agreed with me that this is their best song, is the closing track on Ironworks, which is called Mouth of Ghosts, which is just this stunning song that is like has pianos and
ridiculous,
this sweeping, incredibly huge ending. It's an amazing, amazing song. Like it's automatically, having revisited this record this week, because I heard it initially years ago when I couldn't really appreciate who this band were anyway, and what they were doing. But coming back to it this week, it instantly rocketed into my list of the best closing tracks of all time. Stunning, stunning, stunning song. So yeah, Ironworks is a difficult, wriggly album, but I think the highs are sensational, and it's not.
You're correct. It's an album that takes a whole lot of risks. It's just like they just don't all land for me. It's still an excellent album. It's just that like, I don't know. I just prefer them a little. Like I think that the balance is struck on One of Us is the Killer the most, but also like the consistency is really where it's at. Like I think you're really gonna like Option Paralysis, which I think is the next one you're about to go to, which is just a really great fundamental like muscular album. It's basically a level up of Calculating Infinity in almost every way, and it just knocks. So you'll probably fucking like love that one, I think.
I think Ironworks is great. The first 3 songs are amazing, and then from Milk Lizard onwards is also amazing. It's just that stretch in between that probably could have been edited down a bit. Whereas something like Miss Machine is just, there's not a single thing on that I would cut. It's just rips. And the great thing about Miss Machine is that the best songs I think are staggered really nicely across the whole thing. Yeah. Like my 2 favorites are Sunshine the Werewolf and Unretrified, which is the second song and the second last song. And they're just absolute bangers. Amazing, amazing record.
Fuck yeah.
Also want to shout out a record we're going to review next week that I'm very excited to talk about is the new Armand Hammer album. So Armand Hammer
yeah.
is a rap duo made up of Billy Woods and Elucid, two incredibly talented rappers. And I've been going back and listening to their back catalog because they've done a few collaborative records together under the Armand Hammer name. I listened to the record they put out last year, Shrines, which I thought was really good. My favorite record they've done is actually before this new one anyway, which I don't want to talk about just yet, but I really want to shout out also their 2018 album Paraffin is excellent as well.
Yes.
Really, really love that record. Really talented group. I'm super excited to talk about the new one, especially with that Alchemist production.
If you liked that new Diablo and the Black Messiah album, fucking go listen to Paraffin.
Next thing I'll shout out is I don't know if we'll actually get the chance to talk about this or not because we've got so many things lined up to talk about, but I listened to the new collaborative record between Floating Points, the electronic music producer, and Pharoah Sanders.
So did I.
Pharoah Sanders, the legendary saxophonist, and it's called Promises. It also features the London Symphony Orchestra. It's this one sweeping 40-minute piece that's split up into these different movements. Again, another instance of just pointless splitting up because it's just one track really. But anyway, it's great. It's really good. It works on this repetitive melodic motif that circles through the whole thing. But the way that Pharoah and the orchestra kind of weave in and out of it, and there's these massive climactic highs and these really quiet and subtle lows, and it's just this really sweeping and beautiful piece of music. It reminded me, not in sound, but in like structure and style of something that like Matt Moss would do. It's just really fucking cool and inventive, and I super enjoyed it. And so yeah, I want to shout that out. I also revisited a classic post-hardcore record, maybe the definitive post-hardcore record ever made in terms of like impact and significance, and that is Yank Crime by Drive Like Jehu, which is absolutely baller from start to finish. Absolutely ridiculous album. Really not much to be said except fucking listen to it. It will blow your mind.
I have a note on that album. I listened to that for the first time when I was like 17 and was like, yeah, this is cool. And then I listened to it again maybe 6 years later, having listened to so much more post-hardcore. And it's one of those albums where I find that the more you are familiar with the genre, like the more rewarding it is to go back to it, because the same thing that we were kind of talking about with Slint, where it's so foundational to the sound of so many other artists that like, it stands up on its own completely. Like, that's not to say that you're not going to listen to it and enjoy it right off the bat, but at least for me, that's an album that I've just gained more appreciation for as I've gotten older, and as I sort of understand all the ways that it had like this really huge impact on the sound of that genre.
Yeah, it's like it does for post-hardcore what Unknown Pleasures by Joy Division did for post-punk, in the sense that it's not necessarily the very first thing, but it's the thing that really kicks, because obviously there are some Unwound records that predate it and other bands as well, but it's the thing that really kickstarts it in terms of general significance. And it's also just a masterpiece in and of itself, like flawless from front to back. So well worth checking out if you haven't. I also want to shout out, I listened to a Venetian Snares record, the first sort of significant Venetian Snares record called Songs About My Cats, which is a really awesome piece of, it's very primitive breakcore stuff, but I really enjoyed it. And it has a very funky looking cat on the cover. And I two more things I want to shout out. I listened to at the behest of Morgan, I listened to the Turnover album Peripheral Vision just yesterday.
I did too.
Which is absolutely blissful, and just a completely sumptuous listening experience from front to back. I really liked the fact that it is this it works within a particular kind of standard template of dream pop, but also it has this real sense of propulsion and thrust to it that not every band in the genre have, and the hooks are great. Really, really love that album. And the last thing I want to shout out, and I won't speak about it too long because I am going to make sure that we do review it sometime soon. A brand new release from an artist called Riley Walker, who I know is a really funny Twitter personality who has been endorsed by Jason Isbell and those sorts of alternative folk musicians. And he put out a new record called Course in Fable on Friday. And it's a collaborative record with a number of different studio session musicians that Riley's been working with, most notably John McIntyre of the band Tortoise. And it is this fucking fantastic proggy folk opus of an album. Like it just, it's a record where it's very difficult to describe how it sounds. It works within a particular kind of alternative folk template that you'll be familiar with from your his name, the drinking songs guy, Matt Elliott, and your Jason Isbell's, and your all those kinds of and your the other one that came to mind was Bonnie Prince Billy as well. But it's all those kinds of styles of singing and songwriting, but it's in a prog lens. So it just is all these shifting arrangements that are always changing direction, but they're always kind of like great melodies that they are always driven by. It's just a really awesome record. I've added it to the docket, so I'm going to force you to listen to it in that context, but I think you'll all enjoy it to some extent. It's a really creative album that I can't wait to shout out. Seems to be getting super slept on. But shout out to Stereo Gum, who named it their album of the week this week, which is the reason why I checked it out. And it absolutely rules. It's already in my top 5 of the year so far. So yeah, that's my week.
Is that me?
Yeah. If you want to shout anything out,
sure.
then
Well, I went ahead and I pulled it up. So in the last week, I logged the 2000 Taiwanese movie Yi. I logged oh wait, you wanted music? My bad. Never mind. Music wise, I for the most part focused up on anything new to me being relevant to this podcast, just to give you guys good notes. And I listened to some kind of supplemental stuff that I'll bring up as we talk about the albums. In terms of things not at all related to what we're going to talk about, I actually just things that I revisited. The classic Nick Cave album, as Tyler shouted out his name already, Murder Ballads. Pause for reactions, because I don't have a single thing smart to say about it. It's just sort of like, if you know, you know. Revisited.
What's funny about you bringing that album up, Zach, is I would place money on that being the album that has been most mentioned on this podcast that we haven't reviewed. That album seems to come up almost every week in some way or another.
It's just it had been a long time since I was actually inspired, going back to the movie bit that I had started with. I was inspired by rewatching The Assassination of Jesse James to listen to a little bit of Nick Cave, and I popped on a couple different Nick Cave records actually, but that's just the one that really stuck out because it had been well over 2 years since the last time I sat with it, and you never forget that it's a great album or an excellent album, but when you sit there and you're just getting caught up in the storytelling of it, it's a completely transportative, magic experience that no one else but Nick Cave could have made. And
I did the same thing with Let Love In this week. I love that you didn't even mention that, and we were still on the wavelength of listening to that era of Nick Cave just because we both watched The Assassination of Jesse James together.
Yeah.
Just knew it.
Murder Ballads, the film.
Yeah.
And then the last album to shout out, I couldn't even tell you the name of this band. It's some Japanese rock band I picked up off of August, and the album is called Mass of the Fermenting Dregs. And I listened to it. And it was an interesting, as I say, I can't really tell you the name of this artist because it's in kanji and I can't read that. But it was an interesting experience, pretty unique. I don't listen to a ton of Japanese music unless it's like there's like math rock and a few different things. But it was a cool, unique experience, and I enjoyed listening to something that I knew August liked a lot. And Zach, yes.
Sorry, I was going to say, Zach, on the topic of August Core East Asian shoegaze albums, you have to listen to Paranorals to see the next part of the dream, which is a Korean shoegaze record. It's currently the highest rated album, new release, that we've ever reviewed by us. So
2021 release.
Yes, it just came out last month.
Yeah,
I don't think
it
it's
beat out Ohms. Was that what we had as the highest?
I don't think it's
Yeah.
on. I don't think it's on streaming, unfortunately. But you can stream it
It's
on Bandcamp
and YouTube, yeah.
and YouTube as well.
Okay.
But
Best to get the flax anyway.
Yeah, get the flax anyway.
if you can acquire them and via whatever means, I recommend it, because that's, even if you don't care for it, that, which I can't see you not caring for it, that's an album that I really want to hear your take on, just personally, at some point.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a note on shoegaze. It's actually the last album that I wanted to shout out. That is a shoegaze record, and I was inspired by Tyler to revisit it. It's an album that I've listened to a lot, because it is a demo B-sides version of an album that I maybe have listened to the most. And what I'm talking about is Have a Nice Life's demo B-sides tape, Voids. Not very well publicized, not available on streaming, but it is a record that they released, and it's a little two-part album. First part is demo cuts from their seminal shoegaze post-punk record Death Consciousness, and side B were at the time kind of like original B-sides that were cut from that record, some of which have been reincorporated into later Have a Nice Life full-length studio albums. And I just put that on for the first time in a while. It's an album that I've listened to a lot, just to kind of like get into the vibe and tease. We're going to talk
Trespassers W.
Just an outrageously cool project. One of the special things about that little tape for me that I just want to shout is that, like, I find that, obviously for the podcast, you guys will do, you find an artist and you go through their whole discography, but there's there's a special thing once you really start getting into not just every studio album or EP, but you start listening to demos and singles and compilations and live albums, because you're just like, but what about this tiny little track? And for a band like Have a Nice Life, who for the longest time had 2 releases,
give it to
right.
me. I have an itch.
And so you really start. It was one of the first bands that I can remember, not the first exactly, but one of the ones where I can really remember going to every single nook and cranny of a discography to that extent. And that's sort of what that album is.
Yeah, thank you for recommending those to me, because I talked about that like a couple of weeks ago, and I've been listening to that on and off ever since.
Yeah, but that was last week. We talked about that in this segment as well. So it's kind of fortuitous that it's come back with our guest speaker. And also I want to shout out, I talked about this last week as well, but I've been listening to that a lot, but also I've been listening to what is increasingly looking like my favorite Dan Barrett release, which is the most recent Black Wing album, which I am probably the biggest fan of on the planet at this point. I think a lot of people generally agree that it's good, but not like the most amazing thing they've ever heard. And I get it. But for me, that record is just amazing. I weep every time I put it on. And I want to put out one recommendation, even if you've already heard the album. It's not even listen to the album again. It's get in your car at night, plug in that too. So many amazing songs on this record, but there's one particular experience I had this week that was so fucking earth-shaking that I have to recommend it. It's get in your car, put the aux in, and turn the volume up and play the song Ominous 80 at full volume while you drive in the dark. And that shit is transformative. And then you just like listen to the rest of the record and it's fucking amazing. So
it's a great record.
Would you say it might have been an earth moving experience?
Yep.
See myself.
Did the plow break the plains, Tyler?
Like the song.
On that note, incidentally, the Black Wing record is doomed. If you've never heard it on vinyl, gotta recommend it, because holy shit!
Both Black Wing records I've been listening to over and over and over and over again. Both of them
awesome.
Both of them are awesome. Yeah, completely agree. Okay, let's jump into our first review of the day, which I think it's only fitting that we kick off with this particular record, and that is the first Antlers album in 7 years following a lengthy hiatus. As our viewers may or may not already know, we very recently discussed the full discography of the Antlers up to their hiatus on a great video that you should check out if you haven't already. Zach joined us for that too. And the reason that we prioritized that so quickly is because Green to Gold was 9. And we've all been kind of quite curious to see where the Antlers would go with this record. And the reason is not just because it's they were on hiatus for a long time and they've come back, but also because, as we discussed in the episode, the records of the Antlers from Uprooted through to Familiars capture this very sweeping arc in terms of emotional and psychological development, starting at this very kind of introspective and sad point and reaching a kind of catharsis and acceptance and a pushing away of the past and an embracing of the future by the end of their record. And it felt so tightly, it felt like such a tight story that reached such a satisfying conclusion that it feels almost strange to think that there could be, or it feels not necessarily strange, but like difficult to imagine where the Antlers could go from here. And the main point that we made in our Antlers video, I think, was the notion that the Antlers, this ephemeral indie act, were Peter Silberman at heart. And whether the band picked up additional members for certain records or not was relevant, but secondary. This is the story of one man's emotional journey, growing up small and both in awe of and dwarfed by the size of the universe, as we discussed in our discussion of the classic album In the Attic of the Universe, looking to the night skies for some kind of refuge to cling to through his lowest moments. We watched Peter let people in as he fictionalized a real-life traumatic relationship into a piece of art that instantly made him famous within the world of alternative music, and would ultimately end up defining his artistic persona in the eyes of the vast majority of people who were aware of him. We then watched as the Antlers project expanded from a solo bedroom act to a fully fledged dream pop band with Burst Apart, Undersea, and Familiars. 3 records that explored Peter's gradual, stumbling journey towards finding peace with himself and saying goodbye to the past, going as far as to externalize that past in the form of physical manifestations of himself that he literally destroys on Familiars. We then saw Peter, in an almost comically tragic development, develop a bout of tinnitus so debilitating that he was no longer able to play the Antlers music live, and retreated inward to make a solo record, Impermanence, which played with silence and slowing his arrangements to a crawl, and exploring the possibilities of his remarkable voice at its most withdrawn and somber. Peter has stated since in interviews that Impermanence could have easily been released under the Antlers name too. And I do consider it a part of this narrative. But recapping all of these records and the story they're a part of, the story of this person's life, is crucial, I think, to understanding the appeal and also the place of a record like Green to Gold. After 15 years of ruthlessly and relentlessly drawing on his lowest moments and worst feelings to craft material that would appeal to people's desire to have their own pain reflected in the most direct, confronting of ways through art, Peter has finally reached a stage in his life that's almost kind of weirdly terrifying for an artist in the most ironic of ways. Peter is content, peaceful. And who wants to hear about how content and peaceful a sad boy indie favorite is? It's not necessarily what a lot of those fans go to the music for. And as such, I think the appeal of Green to Gold is narrower than any of the other Antlers records, at least in terms of the Antlers sound and story. And artistically, it's less layered. It still has some nuance, but it's less. It has less depth in that regard, and it's less kind of. And it still has some insight about the human condition, for lack of a better cliche, but it's less concerned with that. But that said, it's no less poetic. Peter's ability to introspect in the most colorful and memorable of ways is still more than intact on the lyric sheet of Green to Gold. And on the whole, I think the record is a gentle but remarkable document of a kind of nascent and foreign feeling to Peter, that of simple, uncomplicated, and earned happiness that he tries to both cherish and mine for significance, crucially without drawing on the darkness like he has in the past to explain it. And that's something that even when a lot of indie musicians try to talk about happiness and satisfaction and contentment, they often aren't able to do without drawing on that darkness as a kind of comparison point. This is not a record that wants to explain this feeling of happiness or share it by comparing it to the lowest moments. It doesn't want listeners to be reminded of anything that might bring them down or even anything that might make them feel bittersweet. It's by design calming and uncomplicated. And honestly, I do think it's refreshing to have a record with this kind of focus and, for lack of a better word, lack of pretension. Not that any of the other Antlers records are pretentious, but just that generally speaking, lesser artists might try to mine this kind of simplicity for profoundness in a way that I don't think Peter does. It's almost anti-indie in terms of signifiers for a genre where artists so readily evoke darkness, in a sense, feel obligated to. The only song on the album that hints at any of this in any kind of way, I think, is Just One Sec, in which Peter outright states lines like, "Free me from your limiting ideas of me," that do sort of harken back in some sense to a flawed relationship theme, but keep the focus on freedom and not oppression. Any reference to pain and suffering dwells not within those feelings, but focuses on the acceptance that's a crucial part of being freed from them. In the gorgeous single, It Is What It Is, Peter seems to be singing about a friend who's passed away. This is the first day our friend is freed from pain, voyaging on while the rest of us remain. The call could have been answered, the wall would have been questioned, the fall should have been prevented, but it is what it is. Most of my favorite moments on this record are the least conventional. I adore the Yola Tingo-esque instrumental of the opening track, Straw Flower, which feels both nostalgic and entirely at peace. It feels almost like fondly recalling a memory, or if I can be even more pointlessly specific, having something difficult from your past be freed from a negative feeling and newly appreciated as a stepping stone towards the present, where you're hardened and stronger for what you have gone through. Though former member Darby Sitchi's horn arrangements are missed from the band, I do think the record sustains itself beautifully without them. I want to shout out drummer Michael Lerner, who brings the same kind of gentle softness to the record that he did to Familiars. He has this really gentle brushing drum tone that is beautifully suited to Peter's dreamy and sunlit aesthetic. The dreamiest moment on the album for me is the rich and gorgeous Volunteer, which seems to bloom from the tiniest bud to this fully sprouted and manifold thing that's kind of just bathed and swallowed in sunlight. And then this leads really beautifully into the record's longest track, which is the title track, which paints this really vivid picture of Peter and his partner, although it may as well be Peter talking to the listener on this kind of morning walk. And it has this lovely kind of focus where Peter is determined to evoke images of every detail of this mundane but significant experience that's beautiful and meaningful to Peter as anything that he's ever sung about, because now he's able, in a way that he wasn't before, to appreciate the details of things like seedlings sprouting and the last leaves falling from bare tree branches, cicadas and crickets making their own music across the street in a way that's pure and unburdened. And crucially for me anyway, he's able to do this in a way that lets me feel like I have that piece, or at least that I'm able to join him in that moment of uncomplicated clarity and contentment. And it's not an easy thing to do, especially when you have a brain that moves as quickly and through as much negativity as mine does all the time. And in this way, Green to Gold as an album feels less like a series of songs in the way that the Antlers have done before, or like a suite of songs or whatever, and more like a meditation tape, like something you might play when you're kind of trying to achieve some kind of full mind and body calmness, like a tool that helps me to relax and slow myself down. And it's less that I appreciate what this album does for its artistic value as much as I do for like physically what it is able to give to me. And also, I guess that in a certain way, that's kind of similar to the appeal of Impermanence as well, which is, although that record has this kind of subtext of Peter's pain and deafness and stuff, it is also this record that's very much kind of physical in terms of the experience that it gives you as a listener. And it's about it's less about trying to have you think about certain things and more about kind of trying to get you to put your brain in this certain slowed, calmed, subdued mindset. And I think that the extent to which Green to Gold functions as, for me, from my perception anyway, as this meditative tool more so than a piece of art, although I'm sure a case could be made for it as a great piece of meaningful art, is I think where it will kind of sink or swim at the sea of public opinion and music journalism and even your opinions to a certain extent. So I kind of got swept away there. Sorry about that. I was meant to just intro it, but then I got carried away. But I am curious to see or to hear what you think of this album as an experience, what you think of it as emotionally, and where you think it fits in the Antlers discography, if you're like me, Zach, Saoirse, and Jake, or if you're like Morgan, just how the sound of it hits you and what it does or doesn't do for you.
I thought Green to Gold was good. The biggest appeal is that it sounds very, very nice. Production is immaculate. And just the sounds of the instruments themselves are wonderful to listen to. And Pete Silverman is obviously a very talented vocalist, although admittedly some of the hooks on here can tend to grate on me, most notably wheels roll home. Like, enough. It's too many times with that. But yeah, otherwise, there's not much to complain about here, but I also didn't really stand out to me or leap out at me in any way beyond the very sort of facile connections that I draw to it because I'm just so deeply uninitiated with this band altogether.
I do think that I can see why some of the vocals might grate, because Peter is adopting a kind of a specific tone on this record in terms of the way he sings that's much more softened and floaty than even on a record like Familiars, which is the most floaty sounding Antlers album before this one, where there's a lot more clarity in what he's singing. But I do think there's a purpose to the way he sings on this record. It just results in singing that I could definitely see being less attractive generally.
I mean, I don't know. It's really only that spot on the record that comes to mind when I think of, and it really is just the repetition of it. Like once, like 3 or 4 times in the song total I would be like, all right, I don't really enjoy that hook, but it wouldn't really stand out. But since it's in there as many times as it is, I'm like, ugh. Yeah, I definitely think this is a better record than Burst Apart. I found it much more consistently compelling, even if it does similar things. It's good.
Yeah, I have a lot of sympathy with your point of view, but for me, this is so obviously a new beginning for the Antlers. It sounds like very little I've heard from them before. As soon as Strawflower opened the instrumental opener, and you had the sort of like tapping slow rhythm, and those very clean reverb twangs in the higher registers, that makes it almost sound like slowcore Americana, like the end of a Coen Brothers movie. Like I knew that what ended up being true would happen, which is this is the Antlers record I engage with the most on a purely textural level. What I loved about like the first 3.5-ish Antlers records is sort of the lyrics, and music became a gradually bigger part of what resonated with their music for me, although their music was always good. This is like the lyrics I will one day take the opportunity to absorb properly, but my great joy is like if I am having a bad day, if I'm just having a general bad time, I can throw on this album and not have to think too much and just vibe and relax and chill. And this album does that consistently so well. Just from beginning to end. I feel relaxed by this record. I feel at peace listening to this record. I can't tell how like essential it is at the moment, because for a record like this, it really depends on where they go from here.
Well,
Like-
I'd like to speak to something here, because I've talked a lot about how I think this record is most successful as this kind of meditative tool, but also perhaps something that I didn't really speak on enough is how gratifying as an Antlers fan and just genuinely heartwarming it is to hear Peter singing from the place that he's singing on this record, and a lot of the sentiments that he expresses as well. It feels like a genuine earned contentment that I don't think we've ever really heard on an Antlers record, or Peter's solo record or anything like that. And perhaps it makes for something that's less artistically juicy, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
But I don't hold that against the record. And I think that's basically the heart of it.
I feel like I'm listening to Yolo Tango was referenced earlier. I thought of I Can Feel the Heart Beating as one, and their Old Joy score specifically a lot listening to this record.
Well, yeah, and then like listening to the opening track on this thing, I was specifically reminded of the opening track of I Can Hear the Heart, the Return to Hot Chicken, that kind of gentle instrumental introduction with the kind of like reverbed guitars and this kind of twinkling sort of sound lulls you into this world. Another cool record that I also doesn't sound like this really, but it was a specific and explicit reference point that Peter stated is the later records of Talk Talk were heavy influences on the direction of this record, just this notion of like mellowed, deconstructed sounds of rock music without wanting to make like a post-rock record or anything like that. And specifically, a specific reference to that record is the fact that there's 10 seconds of silence and ambient noise that open this record before any instruments begin playing. And that's a deliberate reference to the 10 seconds of the same thing that you hear at the beginning of Laughingstock. It was intended by Peter to evoke the same kind of calming atmosphere as the beginning of that record. And so in a sense, this is kind of like a 40-minute Merman.
Right.
That's a great comp.
I mean,
Wow.
I mean, fantastic in theory. Clearly, takeaway varies.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's hard for me to get incredibly enthused about it, because my feeling on it is just, wow, I just feel so calm listening to this record in such a beautiful way. So it's not like I'm reviewing like the latest like Deftones or Phoebe Bridgers, where I can get really exaggerated about my emotions listening to them. Whereas this is just like, yes.
Well, yeah, I think it's that it touches on something interesting in terms of like the stuff that we appreciate and talk about when we review records and cling and get attracted to. And it's this kind of emotional urgency and immediacy and a kind of darkness and a rawness and a, unpacking, universal shared experiences and stuff that we kind of all gravitate to in music. And this is very much kind of not doing that in a certain sense.
Like the Antlers were nowhere near the first like act starts out just like a kind of a folk act that gradually gets less interested with like immediate lyricism and striking music, but gets more interested in like textural exploration and then ends up doing it really well.
And I think
there's a linear,
another comp I want to bring up that Zach may or may not bring up at some point as well, that feels apropos. It's not, again, there's a very distinct difference, but at the same time, it feels like Peter is connecting more with the roots of his influences, specifically the Phil Alvarez influence. And the notion of this kind of minimal indie folky stuff that kind of is trying to get at this sense of a connection to nature and a kind of peace through nature and a peace through a kind of shedding of earthly possessions, a shedding of things you've been shackled to in some sense, and just kind of, again, like that on the title track, that kind of embrace of the world around you as well. There's that in this record too, and that's another way in which it feels like this is a coming full circle as well as commenting on a new stage in Peter's life. So we haven't heard from either Jake nor Zach yet. I am curious to hear from whoever wants to.
I like the album a fair bit. I had a lot of shit that I had written down that was much better expressed elsewhere, so I'll just kind of spare everyone being repetitious and say that it's an interesting, I don't mean this in an inherently negative way, but it's an interesting record through being kind of the least interesting Antlers release, in that it is just so much of a departure and so very focused on a mood. I think it was telling when Zach talked about at the very end of our Antlers discussion, he talked about sort of evaluating these albums from a holistic perspective and like not being able to evaluate them on a singles level. And I think that like almost comes close to not applying to this just because it's such a left turn for where they've been going. But ultimately, I also think it was kind of a necessary thing to do, just because they've basically branched out and done everything they could have at this point from like where they started, I think. So going in a direction that sounds like the album to me sort of sounds like a convergence of like early Fleet Foxes mixed with Sufjan Stevens at points, and like it's a sound that fits them very well. I also did find it very peaceful, very calming. It wasn't like I like it a fair bit, but I liked it more and more upon each re-listen. I think that it does kind of take a bit getting used to. I think that some of the sounds here, while it is very immaculately produced, I do think a lot of it does, it sounds more interesting in the context of the band itself and less interesting in the context of like indie folk music as a whole. I think a lot of the sounds they play with are good, they're beautiful, they're refined, but they're also not anything particularly unique. So, it's sort of dependent on how you get on with it. But the more I listened to the album, the more I was able to get into it. And I think that maybe you just might have to be more invested in the narrative of the band, because my mileage that I got out of this was not that I saw a band making this very calming, lush music, but that I saw the Antlers making this lush music. And Tyler sort of talked about how that fit in with Peter Silverman, and it's just sort of like after you listen to something like Attic, you listen to something like Hospice, you listen to something like Familiars, and then you move on to Green to Gold, and there's sort of a novelty in getting to see him see this sort of peace and tranquility in this kind of record. So there's something to be said for that. I think it's in a curious position where it simultaneously does and does not depend on your relationship with the band. It's an accessible record in and of itself, but I feel like you, in order to get out of it what I get out of it, or what Tyler gets out of it, or what Saoirse gets out of it, it's sort of a career trajectory thing. I would sort of, listen to this last. I would almost argue that while it's not my least favorite Antlers release, it might even be the least essential, depending on where they go after this. But yeah, it's a great record. I like listening to it. Brought me a lot of peace. Had a lot of anxiety. Managed to turn it on, and it always kind of even me out. And yeah, I'll shut up. But it was very good. I like it.
One thing I'll just say real quickly before Zach jumps in is that one of the greatest strengths of this record, I think, is that it offers something that no other Antlers records offer. It offers a particular atmosphere and a particular state of mind and a particular sound that I think is unique in their catalog, whether you find it interesting or not. And so it's nice to when an artist comes back from a break with a record that feels like something genuinely new, like a genuinely new chapter, a genuinely new sound, a genuinely new feeling. And that's what I appreciate most about this record, both that it does that it feels satisfying, and that it also feels like a beautiful emotional epilogue to everything that came before as well.
I think a lot of my notes for these three records are going to be pretty similar. Obviously, I'm guesting on the podcast, and one of the reasons for that is because all three of these bands share the quality of having made material for which they became famous in the 2000s. And now here we are, about 20 years after the fact, talking about new material. And in the case of the Antlers and Death from Above 1979, we're talking about bands that have, small hiatuses for one reason or another. And so naturally with these types of projects, it's important a little bit, as we've sort of discussed, to develop a degree of context for what's happening there creatively, not that you need it. One thing that I think is sort of interesting, given the context of the Antlers discography to me, is something that we've kind of talked around, which is that every other Antlers album up to Impermanence, which maybe is the first break from this, and it's not an Antlers album, so this makes sense, are all written in a way that is very narrative. They are all very much driven not by just darkness emotionally, but conflict. And to me, that's sort of one element of this that I think is kind of interesting, is that in order to make this sort of musically formal experiment wherein the goal is a tonality of relaxation, like you might get from a really great ambient pop record or something along those lines, is lyrically, Silverman doesn't imbue the songs with a deal of context, which leaves it without much of any kind of concrete narrative progression, because without conflict, there can't be much of that. And that's kind of interesting, because insofar as the goal is to be calm, that's not so much of an issue. I think where perhaps this falls a little bit short of other similar types of projects like we've named previously, like the Microphones or Mount Erie, for instance, is that Pete Silverman, unlike Phil Elverum, is not a songwriter, or a lyricist who really works with imagery in a strictly sensory way, the way that you might find on a project like Sauna, where Phil comes in with his sparse vocals, and it creates more of less of an idea, less of a cogent, progressive, linear narrative, the way that Pete Silverman tends to write songs. And I think that that's a little bit at odds with how sort of placid and I don't want to say like it's like inert totally, because I think that there is a rhythm to it, to this record. There is a purpose to it. There is value to it. I don't want to sound totally negative about it conceptually, but I think that that's sort of where it leaves me. And unfortunately, this is a band where, with Impermanence and with one of my favorite, and maybe my favorite Antlers release, Undersea, there's a couple of different records that do a similar kind of it's all washed out in the aesthetic, and it really is about creating an emotional vibe where, and this may just be personal taste, the emotion is more compelling and the style is more out on the edge of what it's trying to do. Obviously, Impermanence has very special circumstances around it. That's probably the most similar sounding Pete Silverman project to this one. But the sparseness, the quietness, his vocals, feel so much more exclusive to the Antlers. Whereas when I listen to this, it evokes a little bit of Tinder Sticks. It evokes a little bit of Owen Pallett. It evokes a little bit of Fleet Foxes. And therefore, it just kind of ends up sounding like, I don't want to use the word generic too harshly, but it sounds like a lot of other indie pop, indie folk, chamber pop type records that have been released in the last 15 years without much to set it apart from the fact that when you listen to it, it falls nicely within the overarching story of the band. It is a good, lovely sounding, well arranged, and calming, soothing, beautiful album. I don't have anything harshly negative to say about it, but I have to concede that it is, apart from maybe their debut, the least compelling Antlers project to me. And that's, coming from someone whose favorite stuff tends to look a little bit more like Hospice, who, maybe is looking for the things that Pete's trying to get away from. So, I wouldn't want to hold this album's feet to the fire. It has a clear intention, and I think that it achieves that intention very well. I think that there are certain things where it could push itself stylistically more. Pete could be doing, more unique things with his vocals, like we've maybe seen him do on Burst Apart or Familiars. And I certainly think that you can detect the lack of brass, which really defined the most recent Antlers releases due to the loss of Darby from the band. And so it feels, again, kind of more similar to Impermanence, a little bit more stripped back, maybe lacking in some of the density that might have helped, create more of the ambient pop side of this, where the texturals, the texture and the arrangements themselves could have been compelling in place of a stronger narrative idea, in my opinion.
I totally get what you're saying. And this is definitely a curious situation, because it's a record that does fundamentally sit at odds with the entire discography that precedes it. And it's also a curious case of a record where clearly, and I think you'll all agree, the decisions that were made in terms of keeping the palette of this record so restrained and Peter's vocal decisions so restrained were clearly purposeful in terms of trying to holistically unify a very particular sound and make sure that it's never so obtrusive as to dissipate or dampen the very specific kind of mood it's trying to evoke, this pure contentment.
It's difficult for me. Like, I totally understand that objective. And I also recognize that there is tinnitus, that the entire incident that led up to the creation of Impermanence that maybe throws an asterisk on what I'm saying here just a little bit. But it's difficult for me to think of Drift Dive and Corsicana and Hounds. Some of those are very melancholic tunes, admittedly, that would be not totally emotionally appropriate. But it feels like you could take some of those principles and apply them to this in a more interesting way, where instead of feeling pleasant, it feels evocative, it feels cathartic, it feels powerful. And I don't personally have that with this. I think that it's sort of relaxing and nice without having any sort of firepower, which is a rare sort of thing for the Antlers, because even at their most subdued, I find them to be evocative, typically. And I wouldn't say that they're not, that this is, inert or without emotional purpose. Again, just to a lesser extent, unfortunately. And I wouldn't say unfortunately. It's a new era, and I look forward to anything that they have to put out in the future. Really,
yeah,
to see what they build on from here.
More than anything, I'm glad it exists, and I think I find perhaps maybe what you're lacking a bit. And again, when I think some of the stronger moments are the moments where the arrangements are there. I mean, they're still minimal, but there are moments I think here where there's genuine kind of ambition and like what you're talking about it lacking, I find in songs like Volunteer and Stubborn Man, for instance. I love the way those songs kind of build and crest. And I do think it's a clear decision to not have the record do that too often. And when it does happen, for it to be in a very kind of incredibly dreamy and singular way that perhaps doesn't have a lot of the flourishes of some of their other records. So it would be interesting to see if they do make another record, whether now that this kind of sunlit, because again, those other records previously are so dreamy and nocturnal, whereas this is kind of the inverse of that. It's so sunlit. It's like you're staring into the sun at certain points in a way that...
So a weird off-the-wall comparison that hadn't occurred to me until we started talking about this might be like Youth Lagoon's Year of Hibernation, which I think is a bright, warm, sunshiny record that manages to have a lot more of an emotional hook for me. And I understand that like this is not that. They were not trying to make that album. But that's an example to me where you could take this basic type of thing and really start to move it in a really compelling direction.
And that's a beautiful comp, because this is a strong 7.5 light 8 record for me, and that is a 9.5/10 album through and through. So I totally get where you're getting at, and perhaps we don't disagree as strongly as maybe it even seems, but I do think we have slightly different experiences with this record that are quite interesting, and Jake probably sides with me pretty strongly in terms of it just purely being valuable for the calming peacefulness that it offers, even if that perhaps isn't as conducive to the layered, nuanced, emotional significance of some of their other records. And yeah, I think that's probably a fair place to wrap it up. Let's move into our favorite tracks and ratings for Green to Gold. Jake, do you want to lead us off?
Yeah, my 3 favorite tracks are Wheels Roll Home, Stubborn Man, and probably It Is What It Is. Least favorite track, I'll probably say that as much as I appreciate the title track, I will say it's probably one of the comparatively weaker songs for me, so I'll say that, and I give the album an 8.
Morgan.
My 3 favorites are Porch Light, Stubborn Man, and It Is What It Is. I don't really have a least favorite. I'll probably say Wheels Roll Home just because I don't like the hook, but I mean, it's whatever. 6 out of 10.
Okay. So my favorite tracks are Straw Flower, Just One Sec, Stubborn Man. I don't know. Volunteer's least favorite. I don't know. It's getting a 7 from me.
Hey, my favorite tracks are Straw Flower. I'm delighted to see the universal love for that, even though it's an instrumental track. I just find it utterly entrancing. Also, Volunteer and Green to Gold. I actually think, just to contrast, Jake, because contrast is fun, I actually think that Green to Gold has one of the strongest melodies of the record. And yeah, least favorite track, I don't really have one either. I guess if you put a gun to my head, I might say Porch Light maybe, but I don't really think it's measurably weaker than any other track on the record. And yeah, I'd waver between a 7.5 and an 8, but I think I'll stick with a 7.5 with the caveat that numbers are meaningless. And I've been listening to this album all week, and I'll continue to put it on all the time. It's really good.
Yeah. No,
3 favorites, I think. It's kind of tough. This is a little tough. So I think my favorite song on the album is Volunteer. I think I would pick Straw Flower. And I'm kind of between Porch Light and Solstice, but I'll go with Solstice just because it hasn't been shouted yet, I don't think.
Yeah, great song.
That's a strong song. And then I would concur with Jake. I think Green to Gold, kind of for the same reason as Morgan, Wheels Roll Home. I'm just like not huge on the hook of it, but it's generally a very, very consistent record. Oh, and I was thinking maybe a half, but I'm gonna give it a 6 out of 10.
Okay. Lads. So that is a 6.9 out of 10. What else do you have rated at 6.9 out of 10? I hear no one ask. The answer is still
nice.
KG. Fuck you. The answer is KG by King Gizzard, Gore by Deftones, and the artwork by Liturgy.
It all comes full circle.
The very
Yeah.
first Zach guest review we ever had. Delightful. Okay, well, on that note, we'll move on swiftly on to our second review of the day, which is I wish I'd written down what number this is in their catalog, but it's the umpteenth album from experimental rock group. I know I usually decry the use of the word experimental, but it does feel appropriate for a lot of the things that Xiu Xiu do, and I think that Jamie Stewart would embrace that label. Xiu Xiu.
This is their first single with Basket of Fruit, right?
Yes, but the thing is with Xiu Xiu is that they have albums and they also have other albums. Like they have records of like cover records and collaborative records, and they have like a sequence of very clear studio albums from Xiu Xiu, but they also have other projects that are kind of like under the Xiu Xiu name, but are like not necessarily part of the full album sequence. And I can hear Morgan just screaming internally as I say that. But I would consider, I've kind of wavered on this throughout the week, but I think I would consider, and I think Jamie would say that this is the follow-up to Girl with Basket of Fruit. It is a Xiu Xiu album proper. It is because, and the reason is that it is for the most part original songs, despite the presence of collaborators, and those collaborators I think exist on the record to help embellish the songs, and because they are in a sort of an integral part of the reason the record exists, and kind of one of the general ephemeral conceptual overtones of the record. And because I spoke at length about the Antlers record straight out of the gate, I'm not going to review this straight away. I'll save my thoughts until later, but I will give a little more context. I don't know if any of you, I don't know, Jake, if you listened to this or not, but last night I listened to the interview that Jamie did with Anthony Fantano.
Last night I did as well, actually.
Nice. And one of the things that Jamie spoke about in that interview was the fact that this record, the whole idea for this record arose out of a situation in around 2019 where Jamie was essentially, in his own words, fucked over really badly by a number of people in the musical world that he trusted, who basically stabbed him in the back in some unspecified way that led to a really, really bad period mentally for Jamie. And if you've been a Xiu Xiu fan in the long run, you might remember a time in 2019 when Jamie was not doing so well openly on social media and had to kind of withdraw to deal with a period of incredibly suicidally difficult pain. And that's something that Jamie has been open about experiencing many times over the years, and has obviously informed a lot of the music of Xiu Xiu. But anyway, that whole being fucked over, basically, and that whole open meltdown that Jamie had to a certain extent on social media led to a lot of musicians reaching out to Jamie to offer their support in a way that he was not expecting. And that pulled him out of this latest suicidal spiral far more quickly than he was expecting to be pulled out of it. And so as a result of that, it became a desire of Jamie's to make a record that essentially served as a tribute to and an incorporation of the support of friends and the music world, and just the importance of that having someone in your life to keep you grounded. And that's a loose, ephemeral theme in this record. The songs on this record go through a lot of different themes and ideas, but overhanging it, and with the decision to have every song be a different collaboration, you have that sense of camaraderie of that I think makes this one of the most, if not the most optimistic and bright Xiu Xiu records, relatively speaking. It's certainly one of the most optimistic, and it certainly has an arc where it ends in a very optimistic and upbeat place for a Xiu Xiu album. And I think it definitely distinguishes itself in their catalog, not just for having all these collaborations, but also for tonally feeling like, especially coming after a record like Girl with Basket of Fruit, which many would say is the darkest Xiu Xiu album to date.
Tough. That's a high bar. It's, you know.
Oh, it's one of them. It's one of them anyway. Who cares about absolutes? It's one of them. But anyway, this feels like a very distinct pivot away from that. There's definitely some darkness on some songs here, but generally speaking, especially because of the presence of so many other voices, it feels like a record that is much more trying to move forward. Anyway, I had lots of thoughts on it. I know maybe not necessarily everyone will, but rest assured, I do have plenty to say. But I will step aside for a bit just to let everyone else kind of talk about how they found the record, what sort of stands out about it, what maybe doesn't stand out about it, whatever you think.
Xiu Xiu, fascinating band, been around for many years, released a lot of albums. They probably have, as a group, one of the most impenetrable discographies of like the past 20 years, which is not to say that, you know, again, as Tyler kind of intimated earlier, it's not about the absolutes, but it's about this idea that this is a band where within the context of any given Xiu Xiu album, let alone all of them, they are never able to be kind of pinned down to one sound or one emotion. You take an album like Angel Guts Red Classroom, which I would consider to be, I wouldn't use the word accessible precisely, but it's one of the most like upbeat, energetic Xiu Xiu albums, and it takes you from various emotional and sonic extremes, one right into the next, and it makes listening to their music, you know, really invigorating, really engaging. Always kind of, you know, never totally know what to expect in it, and it can take a little bit of time to sort of understand the sequencing. And it is the reason that I bring all that up is because this is maybe the first time I've ever listened to a Xiu Xiu album and immediately understood what it was, understood the arc of it within the space of 1 to 2 listens, because the sort of emotional arc of it is so, as has been stated, really unlike anything that I've experienced with them before. This is really the story of Jamie Stewart and all of his friends getting together to go to the gas station and buy hot Cheetos and Fuego Takis and have a good old time. This is a really fascinating project. Obviously, at first glance, I the first couple times I listened to it, I sort of assumed that this might fall along the lines of Xiu Xiu's past cover albums, something that was kind of within the main discography but felt a little ancillary, like you know, kind of the B-sides of their discography, so to speak, as opposed to a main release like Girl with Basket of Fruit. But as I listened to it, I really kind of came off of that impression and started to see this much more as, admittedly, an outlier, but still a Xiu Xiu album. And the reason that I feel that way is because it is not the case that the guests put so much of their own musical stamp on these songs that they cease to be Xiu Xiu songs. Tyler and I, obviously speaking on the single Rumpus Room, have kind of discussed a little bit that is well and truly a Xiu Xiu album, or Xiu Xiu single, excuse me, even though it has the presence of Liars and some of their musical DNA in it. All of these are songs that first and foremost belong to this album and its concept and its sort of emotional building to catharsis, which I thought was interesting. I really kind of expected it to come across a bit more anthological, where each track maybe had, you know, the Liz Harris track would go into ambient directions, whereas maybe the Sharon Van Etten track would go in a certain type of direction, versus the Drab Majesty track might go in you know, like kind of a dark wave synthy direction. And instead, it's really the case that each one is kind of supplying just the teeniest little bit of flavor in some cases. That's less true on a cut like 100 Years, which is really drenched in classic 2010s Chelsea Wolfe reverb, and obviously covering a very classic goth rock song. Overall, I found this to be really interesting, if not necessarily quite as impactful. I maybe sort of found myself wishing that some of these tracks were more idiosyncratic in either direction, by which I mean, when you listen to most other Xiu Xiu albums, as we've talked about, kind of the emotional tonality of them is a fair bit darker. And that's not necessarily what I'm looking for so much as just that this lacks, to a certain extent, maybe some of the just kind of raw creative punch of some of those things. And it's compensating with these guest artists, but maybe not to such an extent that, it kind of feels caught in the middle in the way that some collaborations sometimes can, instead of feeling like each party is at the kind of peak of a respective creative expression. They are kind of meeting in the middle in a way that kind of feels like it lowers the ceiling on both halves. Fair or unfair, I don't find this to be quite as moving or wildly engaging as Girl with Basket of Fruit, and I don't find it to be as aesthetically engaging as a solo Chelsea Wolfe album. But what I do think that the real value of this is this record has, as I've stated a couple of times now, a really clear beginning to end emotional idea. And given that it has guests from all over the music world, I think that it gives really a great entry point into what this band is like and some of their kookier idiosyncrasies that can kind of warm you up to a band that I earlier called impenetrable. Because if you are a fan of, let's say Sharon Van Etten or Owen Pallett, as I mentioned previously on the Antlers review, who is on this album, if you are a fan of one of those acts, coming into a Xiu Xiu album that has those little entry points for you might kind of soften and sort of allow you to kind of get a grasp on all the different things that are going on with one of the most creative acts out there. I don't think that this is right off the bat anything that's totally blowing me away, but there's a lot of Xiu Xiu albums that have hit me that way, and I wouldn't be surprised if I still have a lot more room to grow with it. It's certainly something that I've been keen to revisit because my favorite songs on it are either gigantic earworms or like Saint Dymphna, these really emotionally kind of drawn out and bombastic things. And so there's a lot of moments on it that I'm sure are going to keep me engaged with it in the long term. And we'll see where I ultimately end up on it. Right now, it excites me less than their last few releases, but it's still strong. My favorite album that we're reviewing today. Spoilers, but yeah. Anyway, that's all my thoughts, really.
Yeah, I will say that I do think Xiu Xiu are a band, and this is not one of those lazy, dismissive things that you say to people, that some people say to other people when they don't like an album. But there is definitely a band where you do kind of need to spend time with the records, but only if you see the seeds of something that could grow on you. Obviously, if you find it completely alien, then sure. But if you see the seeds of something that connects with you, often the thing with Xiu Xiu records is simply the time and that it takes for the record to unlock itself in front of you. I think this is really a band where if you're able to get on the basic emotional level of it, the records do kind of unlock themselves in front of you with time. I think a really great example of that is an album like Woman is Lovers, or an album like Fabulous Muscles, or the Air Force, or Lafayette, or Angel Guts. All of those albums are albums that present you with the seeds of something that you either will or will not be able to connect with emotionally, and then the dense strangeness of the arrangements is really the only barrier that remains. And I think that kind of the purpose of them does sort of kind of unfurl itself in front of you, especially on a record like Angel Guts, which Zach's already shouted out. And the thing with this record, I'm not going to get into my review with it, I just wanted to say this as an aside. The thing with this record is I was waiting for that to happen all week, and it happened this morning. So it's like this kind of thing can happen at any moment, or it might not happen at all. But the thing with a band like Xiu Xiu is that they do reward patience if you can get on board with them in the first place. And they are one of the most unashamedly idiosyncratic and most relentlessly refusing to compromise bands that are out there. So there's that, and I do think that this is a record that did open itself up to me in a way that I was kind of waiting with bated breath to happen and was afraid wouldn't. And so I would say to general listeners out there to bear that in mind when approaching this or any Xiu Xiu album.
Yeah, I can attest to that. This is my first Xiu Xiu album. I had heard some of the stuff off of the Twin Peaks covers album that I like a lot.
Yes.
This is the first, original music by Xiu Xiu record that I have heard, and I will say I enjoyed it more than I expected to, because pretty much everything that has ever been used to describe this band makes it sound like I would fucking hate them, and I don't. From my impressions thus far, anyway. Admittedly, I am more drawn to the cuts that have people I am already quite fond of on them, such as Chelsea Wolfe and Sharon Van Etten. Those are my two favorite tracks, followed by A Bottle of Rum. Like all of those and a handful more, quite a bit. But I do find myself sort of held at arm's length with it. And I think what it might be is just that I haven't had enough time to process it, because it's nearly an hour in length as well, is another thing. And the first time I heard it was Wednesday, and I've only heard it twice in the meantime. So and the shame is I probably won't go back to it, at least not for a good long while, because there's stuff we have to listen to for next week, and then there's so much stuff that I want to listen to just for my own pleasure in the interim that I haven't already heard, and this is just not something I'm particularly interested in revisiting in the interim. But we'll see. Maybe I'll feel differently in 6 months. What I will say as a sort of hard-bodied criticism is that I do think the record is just too long. I really feel like one or two tracks could have been cut from this and just sort of save it just add a touch more brevity to it. But that's really it in terms of firm negative criticisms. Otherwise,
I just want to add to that what you were just saying, and say that I'm looking at the full Xiu Xiu discography in my Winamp app right now, and aside from the Twin Peaks cover album, which is not like a record of original music, this is the longest Xiu Xiu album by some distance. So that is definitely a valid critique. I think they are a band that I think they pride themselves on a particular kind of punchiness and an immediacy in terms of some of the emotions that hit, even if the arrangements are less immediate. And that perhaps is maybe a little lost on a record that drifts like this one does at certain points.
Yeah, I think by the sort of the 2/3 mark, it sort of starts to become a little aimless, I guess, and it sort of comes across that way, but it finishes strong enough. Otherwise, this is just, something that is either not really my thing, but that I can appreciate, or something that I just need more time to acclimate to, and we will see. Maybe.
I think ultimately, just knowing that you're coming from the outside, insofar as you were getting interested, it's kind of like, it's a good opening door that sort of like simultaneously takes a little bit of doing, but also is like the springboard into the rest of it. Like where it acclimates you to the rhythm, and then you go on and listen to other stuff.
What I would say, and I know you get enough recommendations as it is, but if you ever did feel the urge to think, oh, I want to check out a Xiu Xiu record, on reflection, I said Forget the other day, which I think is still one of their more accessible records. But
probably their most.
On reflection, I think the one I'd recommend for you is the Air Force, which is their shortest album. It's only 34 minutes long. And I think it has some of their punchiest songs on it as well. So that's the album I guess I would throw out there if anyone was in the mood to listen to a Xiu Xiu record. I will also say that I was, a few months ago, I was briefly toying with the idea of having a record club on Fabulous Muscles. And maybe someday we will, but I think that's an interesting album in terms of bridging the really severe emotional intensity with hooks in a way that is really interesting. But yeah, difficult band for sure. And I am glad we get to discuss them in this context, even if it's not like the most mind-blowing shit ever.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I won't be long, and again, this is just sort of repeating things that have already been said. And just because I'm not even really sure as to my own feelings, just because every time I listen to this, I just like, I thought the same thing and I liked it the exact same as many times as I heard it, but it was just, I was never able to pin down my feelings. And I think that if anything, I think the issue it lies perhaps with the production, which I don't think is bad by any stretch of the imagination. It's definitely a departure from the Xiu Xiu albums that I've heard in tone, which again, Twin Peaks, Forget, and Girl with a Basket of Fruit, pretty far divorced from a lot of the stuff on here, even if there's still some elements that make their way into it. But I just don't particularly, I find the aesthetic on this record just to be kind of one note. There's a lot of songs here that feel like they run together, and a lot of it has to do with the sequencing. I think that there's definitely songs on here that are like really far apart from each other when it comes to the actual sound, but with the way that they're placed and sequenced is that like, some of it I didn't even realize like a new song was starting, and that became a really big problem for me because I had to like keep coming back to like really take notes on what was going on, but I'm not going to read any of them. I'm sure Tyler's going to go into much better detail. That said, I do like the moments on the album that stick out to me the most, that sort of wade through the sort of like, the production is very full sounding and has a lot of atmosphere. It's just that atmosphere is very similar. I find it to be not as interesting or engaging as something like Girl with a Basket of Fruit. And it's been too long since I've heard Forget, so I can't really speak to that and how it compares. That said, I really, really love the song. I love the cover 100 Years. It's one of my favorite Cure songs, one of my favorite Cure records. And I mean, yeah, Xiu Xiu and Chelsea Wolfe doing a cover of it just makes a lot of bizarro sense, and then you listen to it and it's like, wow, this is pretty much exactly what I would have wanted from something like this. It's got that really slick kind of descending weird structure that the song has, but then you gotta throw into the Janie's vocals and Chelsea's vocals into it, and it's like, yeah, this is terrific.
And it's
then
like, I feel like a lot of people who, when they're covering stuff like that is so idiosyncratic and like of a certain sound, will like fuck with it to make it their own, and in making it their own just completely sap all of the interesting things that existed about it out of it. Because they're a much less interesting act than the person they're covering.
Xiu Xiu is just an elite cover band.
I was just gonna say that they ride the line between knowing how much personality of their own to inject into it, and also how to retain the personality of what they were doing before, like how to transform it and also make sure it's recognizable. Which and
of course the classic example that Jake will obviously know and Zach will obviously know, but Morgan may not be aware of, is on their album Women as Lovers, there's a cover of Queen and David Bowie's Under Pressure, which is performed with, pause for effect, Michael Gira of Swans.
And it's exactly how you imagine it, but also like better.
It better, for the sake of it, be better than I'm imagining it.
It's great. It's fucking fantastic.
It's great.
If I could tap in real quick, because I think that you've allowed me to articulate something that I wanted to get across in my piece, which is this. When Xiu Xiu, whatever, when they cover our song, they steep their cover simultaneously in the idiosyncrasy of what they're covering, whether it's Badalamenti, Nina Simone, Robert Smith, etc., with their own idiosyncrasy. They turn both things up to their respective maximum thing, such that when you're listening to that song, you can get both flavors. And there's always something interesting about the way that Jamie does that. And maybe what's missing from this album to me is that it feels like it's a covalent bond, instead of having that sort of almost clashing style that their covers tend to have, where it's both things happening simultaneously. It's sort of this meek middle ground between the two of them. Not meek, that feels severe, but
I have to say, while we're highlighting great Xiu Xiu covers, and I love the Badalamenti covers record, but I also love the album A Promise, which has upon it a cover of Tracy Chapman's Fast Car, which is one of the best songs I've ever heard. Both versions.
Yeah, and you're 100% right, both of you. Xiu Xiu are a band that don't cover a song unless they can find an emotional or a tonal kinship between that original song and their aesthetic. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it. And there's one cover that's actually a live session cover that's got a YouTube video. And don't let me forget this, because it's really short and I want to make you all watch it when we've finished here. Mm-hmm. It's a cover of ZZ Top's Sharp Dressed Man.
You've tossed that into the chat before.
And it's just so perfectly irreverent, but also like you can totally see how it fits in their aesthetic, and they completely make it their own. And it's badass. And that song's like a mediocre song, if I'm perfectly honest, but they make it so fucking fun. Anyway, just that was a great aside about their covers that I think was worth having.
Yeah.
You were saying, Jake?
I really, really, really like one of the standouts for me is Saint Dymphna, which I just think is a really, really, really beautiful song. I think the progression of it is lovely. I think the way it just kind of blossoms and explodes near the middle is just fucking perfect. Like I know that this is sort of antithetical to what a lot of people would probably want from a Xiu Xiu album, but I just kind of wish a lot more of the record sounded like this. I find the production here to be like the sort of fuzziness, as well as the fuzziness on the 100 Years cover, to really add a texture to it that complements the song in a way that I feel like it isn't complemented on others. And I guess the only other thing of note that, like, I enjoy the record front to back. I do kind of agree with Morgan saying that it's a bit too long for my liking, but the only thing about it that I am not able to fully get on board with is the tone. And I'm not saying that I want the tone of A Promise or that I want the tone of Girl with a Basket of Fruit. I kind of like the more irreverent side of Xiu Xiu. It's engaging and it's funny. But I frequently am tossed into a place of tonal whiplash that it just feels jarring and not in a complimentary way. There are just moments of there are moments of humor on the song, like Rumpus Room, which again, that's a good danceable track. I've been listening to Liars all week, so of course I fuck with that song. And I think there's a lyric on there that I want to say references Cheetos, but it's either Cheetos or
Cheetos and Fuego Takis.
That's it. Yeah. Like that kind of shit is funny, and on a song like that, it really, really works. And then there's songs where like the final third of it will just have lyrics that are just like I can't remember what song it is, but there's like a part where they just start like it sounds like someone tossed a drum down some stairs and just started saying weird shit. And I was just kind of like, okay, I mean, I get it, but also I'm not really sure what this effect is supposed to achieve on me. I just kind of feel, it's not that I find it annoying or that I feel like it's a bit that goes on too long. It's just like I feel adrift. I just sort of like there's this really full mix and these really like prescient ideas, and then all of a sudden this thing will just happen or a lyric will pop up, and I'm just kind of like, why did that happen? I don't really know how I meant to feel about that.
That's a thing that I feel like happens on every Xiu Xiu record. And I even feel like I can explain it to a certain extent, actually.
Well, my problem is that I shouldn't need an explanation, is that I should be able to listen to this for the third time and be like, oh, hey, this is the feeling it creates in me. And instead I
very much disagree with that. The whole trajectory, and that's not related to, oh no, it's just like, A Promise is, in my opinion, like the best Xiu Xiu album, and it's fairly immediate. And it's not itself until the 30th time you've heard it, because it throws so many challenging things at you. Like it's just in the nature of what they do that it is almost violently confrontational at times. I don't know that it's always done to great effect on every single album, and
that's my problem, is that the confrontational nature of their music. Like my favorite Xiu Xiu album, at least thus far, is Girl with a Basket of Fruit, and that's like really fucking confrontational.
Wall to wall.
And I enjoy, like, you know, again, it's the same reason I get along with The Seer so much, is that is an album that is purely about being beaten the shit out of. And the problem here isn't that I find these moments confrontational or that I find them challenging. It's that I don't find them confrontational or challenging. I find them flabby. I find them extraneous, and I don't feel anything from them at all. It just feels like irreverence for the sake of it, whereas I feel like it could have been more pointed, and I'm just kind of like, eh.
So I think the reason that I interject is because in some cases it is like that still, in some effective cases. And this is more so talking about different records, where I just think that the technique isn't always immediately obvious what the intended effect is. And there's like a purpose to burying it under something like that, where it is a word that Tyler used earlier that I think is really, 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 you know, apt to describe the way that Jamie is as a songwriter, is alien, where the choice is meant to be alienating. It's not meant to be like, oh, I immediately know why that's discordant, is to create a mood. It's like, yeah, you have to like kind of come at it with different things. But I think I tend to agree with you in this case that like there is such a clear arc that like those moments don't necessarily coalesce within the context of that arc totally.
I also want to back Jake up as well and say that those moments, I think, had a lot of impact on the best Xiu Xiu records. But again, the pace of this record, which I think is structured well, but just simply, again, like Morgan said, has a few too many songs, the impact is dulled somewhat by the fact that there is a stretch of this record that do... you know, I think don't quite have the same kind of impact that this record would have if it were just a bit tighter. And it's a really facile complaint, I know, but just when it's true, it's true.
That's the thing, is that I feel like my body is being possessed by the spirit of Morgan as I say this, but the problem that I had, like, I completely understand what both of you are saying, and I recognize that, and I've probably said that about a number of albums myself, but at the same time, it's like, if these things make themselves known to you after 30 listens, then you need to make an album that is good enough to make it worth 30 listens, and I'm sorry, but this album's not good enough to listen to 30 times.
Yeah, absolutely fair. And I mean that. I'm not saying, I know it's very easy to say fair enough, but no.
I feel like with a Xiu Xiu record, it's like, that's the stance that, like, you have to understand that, because this is what this album is. This is what this band is. This act is.
And I think
that's just part of the bit.
I think when you're looking at Knife Play, I completely agree with every part of the last thing you said. This is an album I'll probably listen to 30 times because it's interesting to me. But like, yeah, Knife Play is an album where it's like, oh yeah, there's this thing and I need to listen to that again, you know, where it draws you in, where it's less clear what that is here.
Yeah.
Mostly because it's like the best parts of this aren't replicated anywhere else. If you're really into the Chelsea Wolfe song, there's no other song that really totally sounds like that one, which is part of it.
Yeah, exactly.
But also like kind of alienating in that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think I can add a little bit to the discussion and maybe some defenses of certain aspects of this record. I feel like with a Xiu Xiu record, yeah, it takes a lot of listens to really dive into it. And I feel like a lot of this record has kind of gone a little bit undiscussed just as a result of that, as a result of the fact that, and also as a result of the fact that there's plenty of parts of this record that are just difficult to describe. I had to really sit down and listen and notate my listen to make sure that I can touch on every aspect of this record that I think is interesting, because so much of it is so discordant and strange and ephemeral and shifting from one moment to the next. One great aspect of Xiu Xiu's absurdity, well, one great aspect of Xiu Xiu is their absurdity. And Jake touched on moments on this record where you get this sudden just barrage of of percussion and nonsensical vocals that kind of just stand out and almost kind of repel you in a way. And I think that's a tactic that Xiu Xiu employed a number of times over the years, quite effectively. It often, in my perception, often seems to be used as a way to represent a sudden act of incredibly traumatizing violence and the absurd ways in which the mind reacts against it and dissociates and tries to render it, tries to make sense of it, and ultimately fails and just becomes broken by it. And that's something that I think appears in a lot of Xiu Xiu's music, a just genuinely horrific piece of violence that can't be poeticized, so instead is just rendered in this raw, absurd, gaping wound. And also a lot of the flavor of the way that they go about doing that in their music is informed by queerness as well, and particular signifiers of queer culture and this very particular kind of niche that Xiu Xiu's listenership often represents, not necessarily exclusively, obviously, but certainly to an extent. And I think that the most shocking and difficult moments on this record can be some of the most affecting for me. One track that comes to mind is Goodbye for Good, which is a collaboration with Deerhoof's Greg Saunier. And this is a track that uses rattling sounds, guitar feedback, booming compressed bass drums to create this oppressive scene of suicidal desperation before you even get the lyrics in this track, which actually paint that picture vividly. It is incredibly haunting to me the way that Jamie and Greg take this scene from dreamlike to horribly real by focusing in on particular details the song's character is noticing in the world around them in the final moments before they die, and they just fixate on them. The ending of this song is terrifying and upsetting. You get this, it reminds me of certain moments on The Seer by Swans, actually, that where they musically represent this horrible, terrible thing that's happening without having to explicitly state it in the words. And that's something that's done on some of the early Xiu Xiu records to incredibly vivid effect as well. Another song on this record that I would say the least friendly but most rewarding song on this record, one of my absolute favorites, is a song called I Dream of Someone Else Entirely, which is, according to Jamie, one of the most personal and difficult songs on the record, such that he had to recruit a very close friend, the incredibly talented Owen Pallett, to help him sing. It is a song about generational trauma and pain, very similar themes to the things that Jamie sang about on the first three Xiu Xiu records. It invokes images of his own traumatized parents, that you hear a lot about on those early records, and this idea of just this total fuckedness being passed down through behavior and genetics. I like the way that Jamie is able to create these very poetic and vivid images, but he's also able to sometimes just completely speak in a nonsense way that evokes that just as clearly as very straightforward language. Like sometimes he'll just mangle English entirely and it will just vividly have this incredible effect. All of us whipsawed always. All of us always bewitched by shade. All of us always disconsidered. All of us always together alone. These lines I just find incredibly moving on this song, that barely make sense, but there's enough emotional sensitivity and enough emotional kind of suggestion there to really get me. I like the way that Jamie's not afraid to break and mangle his language to try and get at a feeling that is broken and mangled. It's one of the most emotionally acute songs on the record, and I absolutely adore it. To jump backwards to some of the earlier songs, a song that's already been touched on is the opening track, Sad Mezcalita, a collaboration with Sharon Van Etten, which I think is a stunning song. are absolutely fantastic. Jamie and Sharon's voices soar together in this chorus, and the song is absolutely lathered in reverb. I love the lyric, it's not having something evil endure as it is never having something good, which is a very kind of dark sentiment, but I think that, again, speaks to a particular kind of situation and experience that Jamie's trying to get at. I Cannot Resist is a strangely beautiful song about embracing a simple but blinding love, regardless of the cost to yourself. I love the way that the gentle piano of the song eventually gets kind of corrupted with this throttling and terrifying percussion, these great tape loop noises and fuzz. And then you have this kind of gentle cello part that hangs over the track towards the end for like 5 seconds. And it's just this beautiful detail. The Grifters has a gentle urgency that I think is buoyed by Haley Four's dramatic and operatic voice. This song seems to be one of the most explicit songs on the record about that feeling of betrayal that Jamie experienced many times in the lead up to this record in particular. And I love the approach of giving this song a shuffling percussive stomp that contrasts vividly with weepy cinematic vocals. These two things seem to clash, but in this mangled world of Xiu Xiu, it results in something that feels like it makes sense. I want to also shout out the track Fuzz Gong Fight, which opens with a sample of Xiu Xiu's most well-known song, I Love the Valley O from Fabulous Muscles. And you hear a sample of the song distorted and mangled. And then you have Xiu Xiu member Angela Xiu singing ethereally on the song about some figure of power over her, either in terms of sexual power or some other sense. Though, as is often the case with Xiu Xiu, the lines between, for instance, sexual power and economic power or other forms of ownership, human ownership literally, are blurred, as they are often on a number of different Xiu Xiu records. That all said, the most cutting insult of all is the line, "You never made a record I liked." And I imagine that when you've been through all forms of pain and suffering, as Jamie and Angela likely have, and you've survived to be hardened, that a line like that might cut deeper than any traditional insult. I love that. It's a great moment of just an amusing moment that made me chuckle on a song that's otherwise not very pleasant at all. Rumpus Room's already been touched on. It was one of the singles for this record. It's an absolute banger. I love bringing Angus Andrew onto this track as just an inspired choice for this song. I love the fact that he's brought on, and again, Jamie, the choice of collaborators is so smart here, because you want to bring Angus Andrew onto a track, you want to have him doing the weirdest shit possible, right? And that's exactly what he's doing. He's just saying absolute nonsense lyrics on the song. For some choice examples, it costs a lot to feel this cuckoo, which could be read in multiple different ways, neither of which really makes sense. Lovelessly chalked, lovelessly dried, and my personal favorite, at this one point of the song, he just pleads in this very straightforward way, "Don't you want to openly like me?" Which just made me chuckle. There's another line in the song as well. I can't remember it. It's like something. It has the word cutie in it, I think. Anyway, it's the beautifully absurd stuff that is pure Liars, pure Angus Andrew. But it's, again, just a flavor that's infused into this otherwise quite banging song. And again, these absurd lyrics, I don't think are meaningless. They're like a lot of Xiu Xiu's most absurd lyrics. They kind of hint at a sort of painful sexual urge, or a painful kind of not understanding how to express your sexuality in a way that's socially acceptable. Like being queer, for instance, but existing queer in a world that doesn't accept or understand that. And so as a result of that, being this kind of antisocial person who doesn't know how to express themselves in a socially conventional way. I think that's
what could anyone on this podcast possibly relate to about that?
I know, but I think that's what the song gets at. And so Xiu Xiu kind of explore that feeling in a lot of songs throughout their discography. And it's one of my favorite ideas of theirs, is this idea of the person, the poster, who is so socially inept, and yet so like obviously queer or autistic or not neurotypical or whatever you want to, whatever kind of outsider thing you might that might be a part of you, and just like having to exist in this world that is not prepared you to express yourself, and just being and I mean this in an endearing way, but just like hopelessly incompetent at expressing yourself as a result of that. There's a real tender truth to that experience that Xiu Xiu get at in their music that I don't know if I can think of a single other artist that do that as consistently beautifully and sensitively as Xiu Xiu do as well. There's never a sense of mockery in their songs. It's always a real kind of naked truth that I hope that made sense, but that's kind of what Xiu Xiu is. I will say there's two, I generally agree with the sentiment that this record is a tad too long, and I can even isolate the two specific tracks on this record that I think don't do much for me and I would cut. And ironically, one of them is the title track, which is decent, but it feels a bit slight compared to some of the other tracks. The contribution of the featured artist, whose name I can't remember, feels completely shoehorned into the song and doesn't really fit with the rest of it. And it's just a strange track. It's only 2.5 minutes. I would have cut it. And the other song that I think I appreciate the sheer bold insanity of it, but the song A Classic Screw doesn't really do anything for me either. And I think if you cut those two songs, the record would be 6 minutes shorter and infinitely tighter. That said, I do think that with the fantastic Cure cover that's already been plenty spoken about, I think the record really reaches the peak of its emotional arc in the second half from It Bothers Me All the Time onwards. That track is a piano-led ballad that stretches across a gloomy, menacing 5 minutes. It features Jonathan Mayberg of the band Shearwater. This track is not afraid to collapse into sections of musique concrete noisiness. And crucially, these don't feel shoehorned into the song, but they seem to naturally erupt out of the tension of the song's uneasy protagonist, who is having what I can only describe as an anxiety meltdown in the lyrical subject matter of the song. The song is kind of trying to evoke a sensation of perpetual panic, and it does a great job of getting that through this claustrophobic song without necessarily going the obvious route of making it feel frenzied and fast-paced, but actually slowing it to a crawl and immersing you in the claustrophobia of that experience. It's a really good song. And then I think you get the turning point of the record, which does come close to the end, which is the song Saint Dymphna. Jake has talked beautifully about why the song sounds so great, but lyrically as well, this is one of the most moving Xiu Xiu songs in years. It is based on the story of the title character, who was a 7th century saint who was relentlessly abused and then murdered by her father. That kind of familial abuse, a theme that Xiu Xiu have talked about a lot. And what Jamie does on the song is he takes this opportunity to expand beyond just a depiction of her abuse and a depiction of her emotional experience to actually offer a direct message of support and hope for people that are abused, turning her forced martyrdom into a rallying cry for all victims of parental abuse. The chorus makes me weep. You've tried to run before and you will try again. He is not what you are. His life is not the end. And then the second iteration of this chorus, you've tried to run before and you will try again. This is not what you are. This life is not the end. Just, it's so simple, but in saving such a simple and direct sentiment for this point on the record, it imbues it with so much more impact. And the strings that are happening, the typical clattering Xiu Xiu percussion, it just makes the song feel triumphant and it feels earned, and it doesn't feel cheap, but it feels freeing. And then I love, this is a great piece of sequencing, as you get that triumphantness of that song continues through the rest of the record into the songs Knockout with Alice Bagg and A Bottle of Rum with Liz Harris, who's better known as Grouper. And this sequence illustrates the record's fantastic progression by building on that triumph of Saint Dymphna, that message of hope to someone who's in the most hopeless place possible. and just leading you into the bright sunlight. A Bottle of Rum in particular is a great example of, I think, how this record's really successful, and that this was the lead single for this album. And I heard it when it first dropped and I thought it sounded great, but also kind of formless, and I wasn't really in love with it. But then when it's placed here on this album, at this certain point, it's like bursting through the doors into sunlight, and it feels like such a grand and huge and beautiful ending to this album, a blissful climax. And it's great, and it's just a perfect place for it on the record, and I think one of the best singles this band has put out in a while. And yeah, I do think this album isn't flawless, but I think, like so many Xiu Xiu records, I'm pleased to report that it has really grown on me, and I see a lot of the different things from across all their albums that make them so unique and special integrated into this one record through this overall structural concept of the collab album, of the duets album specifically. I think that it's really beautiful, and it is in many ways, I think, as Zach said, a really solid introduction. And I think that Morgan not hating this album is a testament to that.
I actually think this is quite a good and accessible, comparatively, introduction to what Xiu Xiu do.
Yeah,
I guess
that's exactly what I'm saying. I agree completely. So I just am. I'm really, most of all, I'm still basking in the sheer relief of the feeling I experienced that this did click for me before we were going to review it, because it means that I've been able to provide a little bit of a counterpoint. And there's one thing I love doing on this podcast. It's being the old counterpoint. I think it's cool that we get to talk about Xiu Xiu, and it's cool we get to talk about it in the context of a record that offers so many conversational avenues in terms of all these different guests and stuff.
Regardless of quality, it's never going to be an uninteresting thing to talk about, because
it's Xiu Xiu.
Their existence itself is interesting.
Yeah, totally. And even just talking about this record now, I'm liking it more and more in my mind, and we'll see if that's reflected in how well the record ages as a listening experience. But if one thing is encouraging that I also took away from the Fantano interview that I listened to last night is Jamie said that as soon as they finish a record, they immediately start working on the next one. And so I'm super excited to see if this kind of more positive and hopeful vision for a Xiu Xiu record, even though there's a song on here that has the guy from Deerhoof coming on to sing about suicide. Even though there's that, I'm curious to see.
Also, 100 Years, not a cheery tune.
No, absolutely not. I'm curious to see what happens next for Xiu Xiu in a way that is like, I really feel that curiosity in a way that I haven't felt in a while. So props to this motherfucking Xiu, as they call themselves.
Indeed.
All right.
So,
favorite tracks and ratings. Let's do reverse order. Zach, why don't you go first?
All right. My 3 favorite tracks on this record are as follows. A Bottle of Rum featuring Grouper, aka Liz Harris. Saint Dymphna, featuring Twin Shadow. And I want to shout, this is not one of my top 3, but like, just as everybody is kind of like talked about, Rumpus Room is like the rager of ragers and the banger of bangers. Thank you, Liars. Listen to Liars. If you're listening to this right now, go listen to every Liars album right now.
Specifically Mess if you want to dance.
Yeah, you know what's funny, Zach, is when I was listening to the song, I was trying to think of like what Liars album it's most similar to, and even though it's bizarre, it really kind of is this not really like any other Liars album. The closest comp I could think of was maybe They Were Wrong.
It's the debut. It's the most dance punk, because it is dancey, but it's like specifically in that rhythmic kind of stripped back way. It's either that or Self-Titled are the 2 that would sound most similar.
But yeah, my point was like, if someone liked this track, I would not really have a clue.
But that's how Liars.
Yeah, exactly.
Just go listen to all of them. That's what you should do. Listen to all of them. So my top 3, starting from the top real quick. A Bottle of Rum featuring Liz Harris. Oh gosh, what did I? Saint Dymphna.
Yeah,
Saint Dymphna. And my number one favorite is super easily "I Dream of Someone Else Entirely" featuring.
Yes.
It's just transportative peak Xiu Xiu. Like it's so good.
I'm so glad you agree because yeah.
Lyrically haunting. It's the song outside of like just like the earwormy kind of tracks. It's the one that would mostly keep me coming back because of the compelling nature of its idea.
That song going into 100 years just leveled me this morning.
I think that my least favorite track is I would say it's a toss-up between a classic Screw and the Grifters, both of which I think are kind of, they don't really work for me in the sequencing of the record as well. And I would slap a 7 out of 10 on this for now. But don't be surprised if it's an 8 in the coming weeks or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But 7 for today.
Nice. Tyler.
My 3 favorite tracks are Saint Dymphna, I Dream of Someone Else Entirely, and I'm gonna also throw in Sad Mescalita. And my least favorite track is a classic Screw, and this record gets an 8 out of 10 from me.
Nice. It's not in my 3 favorite tracks, but I Dream of Someone Else Entirely. This is the one time I get to do this, and I have restricted myself because I could have done it other times. What I Owen Palette, of course, has worked for the National, orchestrating for them.
Arcade Fire too.
Yeah, Arcade Fire and Taylor Swift, I think. But what I knew Owen Palette for was he did the orchestration on the album The Life of the World to Come, and he produced In League with Dragons by the Mountain Goats.
Also, shout out Owen Palette. He has some great solo albums of his own right, like Heartland and In Conflict are baller albums.
Yeah, I mean, just an incredibly talented individual right here. I mean, it's a great song. My 3 favorite tracks are Rumpus Room, and Sad Mescalita, and I'm going to say Bottle of Rum. I don't know if I have a least favorite track. Might choose. No, that's a really good song. I don't have one. I'm going to give this track an 8 out of 10.
My 3 favorites are Sad Mescalita, 100 Years, and A Bottle of Rum. I don't know. I don't feel like picking a least favorite. Fucking whatever. I'll say 7 out of 10.
Neat. Jake.
My 3 favorite tracks are Saint Dymphna is my favorite. I'd say A Bottle of Rum, second favorite, and third. I do really like Rumpus Room, but I think I will say that it would be Sad Mescalita. I really like Sharon Vanetten's vocals on that track. Least favorite, continuing in the trend of the last record we talked about, it's going to be the title track, Oh No. And I give it a 6.
Neat. So that's 7.2 on average. And 3 7.2 records we have include Dosey Dreams by Fucked Up, As the Eternal Cowboy by Against Me, and Origin of the Alimonies by Liturgy.
Let's move on to the last record we're going to review today, which is
Death from Above, 1979. Honest to God, maybe the seminal dance punk band in my imagination. In dance punk, for those who may be unaware, I would almost call it like a little bit of a niche genre. It had kind of a time period there in the 2000s where it came up big. Probably if you were to go to Rate Your Music right now and you search dance punk and found the top albums, you would get a lot of LCD Sound System, which of course they work in like a lot of synth influences and things that are different. A band that we've talked about a couple of times here on this recording is Liars. Their early stuff codes pretty clearly as dance punk, although they kind of move away from that as they go on. And so right around the time that Death from Above 1979 releases You're a Woman, I'm a Machine, that's really the hardy, fertile ground from which most dance punk that mattered sprung. And that album really, for me, is kind of the high watermark of this genre. That doesn't mean that there are none that I like more than it. It doesn't mean that there are none that are as good as it. But the reason that it really sticks out as well as it does is because it is blistering. It is lean, and it tells you more or less everything that you can do with a band that has two parts. It's purely minimalistic, it's purely utilitarian, and they manage to cover a lot of different sounds and emotional tones with just a bass guitar, just a drum kit. And that's really cool. And it's an album that was celebrated in its time. It's celebrated now. And it led to a long hiatus for the band. And they didn't release an album. I think I'm not looking at it right now, but I think there's an 11-year gap between that album and the physical world. And something like that,
yeah. It was 2004 to 2013 from memory. So that's 9 years.
So 9 years. Okay, I wasn't sure if it was 9 or 11. I was one of the two. But there's a long hiatus between those two records that kind of, at least for me, that was kind of in on the ground floor of Death from Above. You have this question of like, okay, so they have this very minimalistic, great dance punk sound. Where can they go from here? Do they add new instrumentation? Do they push their sound forward, especially after all this time? And the answer for these last three records, which I think is really contextually important for understanding how I feel about this one, is they really don't. They just kind of make Death from Above records. And that's been true of the last three that they've made, with some exceptions, which I'll talk about here in a second. But that's kind of been the number with this band so far, is that they have 4 studio albums. And while the first one is really great and really punchy and has a lot of great, things that you can say about it, they really haven't gone on to do anything like bold and creative and new since then. With that said, the 2 albums that precede this, I think, managed to capture a little bit of what makes it work. And to talk about that, I want to dig a little deeper into You're a Woman on the Machine, an album that ends with 2 songs that I think really typify what make this band so engaging to me. And those 2 songs are Pull Out and Romantic Rights. The song Pull Out, it's about 2 minutes long. All of the lyrics are not nonsensical by any means, but they consist of turn the lights up so I can see, let your spirit free, girl, push in, push in, push in, pull out, pull out, pull out, pull out, pull out. It's not
your spirit free. Let your spirit free.
And what Tyler is doing there, what the vocalist
is deafening me.
And
wow.
And that's the nature, but that's what it's like to listen to Death from Above at their absolute energetic peak, when the vocalist Sebastian Granger is kind of at his most aggressive and using his vocals not just to bring energy, but as their own instrument on top of the bass and the drums, which is really, really important when your band only has bass and drums to create more musicality and tonality out of using your voice in this way that is really intense and really engaging. And then Romantic Rights, the track right after that, is a song that I talk about all the time because I think it's one of the funniest songs I've ever heard. And it is the closer of that album. And it involves, lyrics like, let me show you how the mailboy flirts. And it's just this very silly, irreverent, funky bass line.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but
and I think
point of order here. You're thinking of Sexy Results, which is understandable.
Yes, you're right. Romantic Rights is also funny. Romantic Rights, which is the second track, is also quite funny. Yes, thank you for the correction. Sexy Results is the name of that closer. And together, those 2 songs back to back really encapsulate everything that makes that first album so great. And I think what the physical world has is a bit of punchiness. And I think what the follow-up Outrages Now has is that kind of irreverent funniness. Neither one of them puts all the pieces together in a totally complete way, but both of those albums still manage to, in effect, make the pieces of the band come together, because Death from Above is kind of like that cookie recipe that you make where it's just flour, egg, and sugar. It's just the minimum number of components you need to make a rock band. And then you get to this album and you realize, oh yeah, wait, it's not a 3-ingredient cookie because you need salt. And if you don't put fucking salt in this shit, it sucks, man. This album is like, as I listened to it the first couple of times, I came away thinking, okay, so just like the last two, it's not pushing them forward in any real particular creative direction. It is kind of a rehashing of what they've done, only it's never once lyrically clever. It's never once particularly punchy. The sort of rock and roll direction sonically of Outrageous Now is gone. And that was a huge part of the personality of that, if only because of the 2010s rock and roll as a genre kind of died. And so it was at least kind of a nice, like, oh, hey, you don't hear those very often. And I get to this, and I thought much like I did, I thought much like I did for the last two albums, that it's like, you know, I can't necessarily point at anything and be like, this is a weak point, but it also doesn't grab me. But by the fourth time I listened to this, I fucking hated how generic it was. And I don't think that there's any particular point that I can go to in terms of substantive criticism, other than the fact that this is produced like butt relative to the last two albums. Like particularly Outrageous Now. Outrageous Now sounds great. This sounds like muddy trash. And I don't know, it's really difficult to totally put my finger on it, except to say that it just feels lifeless, like they're just walking out the same trick. And this whole week I've been thinking about Liars, of course, which we've talked about, a band that never did that, not even one time. And it's like, maybe that's what I want, but realistically, I can think of a band like Lightning Bolt, totally changed up their sound, but who managed to be so creative and so extreme every time that they step up to the plate that they feel distinct, engaging, interesting in a way that this just isn't. And I was just so bored when I was listening to the Antlers record. You know, I maybe wasn't at the total peak of ever listening to the Antlers, and when I was listening to the Xiu Xiu album, same deal. This was like, man, I would rather be listening to anonymous dance punk bands from the year 2004, because at least there's a spirit to them. At least there's a pulse. And I hate to come across as like this overbearingly negative about something that I don't really have any like major criticisms of. It's just like, I don't see what this does that they have not already done once excellently, twice pretty well. Listen to a different album than this. I don't see the point, you know? And I don't know if that's facile. I don't know if it's closed-minded. But it was literally like the more I engaged with it, the less I got out of it, which is one of my least favorite things to be able to say about an album. I feel like by the time you get to, as we've kind of discussed for Juju, by the time you get to listen 5, you should understand it better than you ever understood it. And I got to that point and I was like, I can't understand why they would have written it like this. I can't understand how there's not a thematic idea, a sense of humor, a sense of style, or anything to push this out of the realm of just like, hey guys, we showed up in the studio and we wrote, 10 rock songs. Here you go. Have a good one. And that's it. That's all I see here. And it also is produced badly. So bad. So that's my thoughts.
Yeah.
As I said, I was gonna have some.
Well, there's really only so much you can. I mean, like, again, not to discredit this particular band's sound or even the sound of music that's, very much like this or in this kind of vein. A lot of comparisons that I've seen, like under like Sputnik and Rate Your Music, a lot of like similar artists you might enjoy. A lot of the time I see the band Queens of the Stone Age mentioned, which I don't think is a bad comp at all, because I think they share a lot in ethos of probably their earlier stuff in loud, aggressive, and noisy, and generally the kind of music that fucking stoners listen to. But I think when I started listening to this album, and I was kind of immediately taken with how aggressive it was, how loud it was, how sort of like blown out. And I was just sort of like, okay. And this is like, this is a certain length. This is 30-ish minutes. So, that they can explore a lot of different avenues maybe within this particular sound. And, it just kind of goes for that amount of time. And it's a very satisfying, very robust listen. It's got a lot of interesting ways that it plays with its, Zach called it very utilitarian. And if it sounds like I'm being really, really positive about this album, then I have unfortunate news for you. It's because I wasn't talking about this album. I was talking about You're a Woman, I'm a Machine. And the reason I'm doing that is because this album is exactly the same except worse. And I really don't know what else can be said beyond that, into the fact that it's structured exactly the same way. It's about as long. It has occasional tendencies of like, oh, there'll be like a piano here and like an electronic thing here or whatever.
Yeah,
and
it's
then
like exactly the same, plus a song that sounds like a shitty MGMT cover.
Oh God, no!
Side that doesn't exist.
It's the same cookie recipe. It's the same cookie recipe, but
Glass
you take
Homes
salt
is
out.
what it's called.
It's a small ingredient, and it's in the vocal performances, and it's in the humor, it's in the personality. It's small, but to use that cooking metaphor, it's like that salt brings all that stuff out. It makes all of it feel flavorful, even though it's minimal.
The general purpose of salt in cooking is like you
Right.
put a lot of flavor in there, but what salt does is it elevates it, like it brings it to your palate in a physical way. And every other Death from Above record has that to it. There's something about the mix that does that puts the flavor on your tongue in the way that salt is meant to do.
Yeah,
but this record doesn't have that.
Yeah, y'all ever had matzo bread?
Yes.
It's a lot like that. And basically, if you haven't had it, the way I would describe it is it's a saltine like wafer bread that does not have salt on it, so it tastes like cardboard.
It's dough.
But you were eating like a really buttery cracker last time, and you're like, it's still flour. It's still, it's got all the stuff. Why the fuck isn't it the same? And it's just missing that little thing.
And it is for Lovers is 4 minutes shorter than You're a Woman and I'm a Machine, and somehow feels 10 minutes longer. Mainly due to the fact that it's like, how you said that they're very utilitarian on You're a Woman, I'm a Machine, and they are. They get a lot of mileage out of that one aggressive sound, and it makes that album feel paced really, really well. It's really fun to listen to. I have a very good time with that record. And when I listen to this, which again is broadly doing a lot of the same things, it lacks that salt, which means by track 4, it feels like you've been listening to this album for like 29 minutes. And you're just kind of like, is this going to ever change or do anything particularly interesting? And then it just doesn't. And it's like, oh.
And the one time it changes, you're like, oh my God, I wish this would change it up. And then it changes it up. Oh my God, go back. Stop it.
I will say, the first half of the record I find much better than the second half, mainly due to 2 reasons. That being, I think Modern Guy and One on One, despite the production being in like, I am not an expert when it comes to music production. I literally only say this in how things sound to my ears. I do not know what it is like to mix a song. I don't know how one mixes a song. I don't know how you can make a claustrophobic mix. I don't know how you can make a spacious mix. That said, when I listen to something like You're a Woman, like, wow, this is really blown out and jagged and aggressive, and it's kind of like lower fi. I love it. And then I listen to this album and I think, wow, this is really jagged and aggressive and lower fi. I don't like it. And I can't really tell you why. But Modern Guy and One on One are 2 songs that get by on the mileage of the fact that they just kind of fucking knock. I also like, more in theory than in practice, I kind of like the dual part of NYC Power Elite Part 1 and 2. I like the first part a little bit more than the second one, even though upon re-listen, that sort of repetitive chorus thing kind of gets old really fast, but still, I like that approach to that track. I think that's an interesting thing that they could have expanded on, and the track should probably be a lot better than it is. But from Totally Wiped Out to No War, this is a fucking wasteland. This is just like, it just gives you a headache, and not even like a good way, like a lightning bolt record might. It's just kind of like, man, what do you, I don't really meant, like, Glass Homes in particular, I'm just kind of like, I don't, like, what is this record's identity trying to be? It's trying to somehow be more adventurous with songs like this, and yet somehow is less interesting.
yeah, it feels like here though they're going through the motions, I guess, and the songs aren't there. And like, I was there when their comeback record came out. It was
I was
all
there playing Death from Above
I was
1979.
there.
The Electro Kids.
To the kids.
They thought it was crazy.
In the 60s.
And they're
in
actually
London.
really nice.
No.
See, but that fucking like that album's got government trash on it, and if you don't think government trash kind of like goes crazy, it goes crazy.
Right.
There's nothing on this album that fucking rocks like that.
Every single they released for that comeback record after the 9-year break was all over every rock station I listened to at the time, constantly. It was inescapable. And when I heard them, I was like, wow, this is, yeah, I know that they'd been 9 years ago, but amongst the rock landscape at the time, this is like fresh. I haven't heard this before. I feel like viscerally attached to this. And then, like 2 years later, like the first, I can't remember how long it was, like the first Royal Blood record came out, and I was like, I have heard this before. From the Death from Above record. So
yeah, my bit has always been that like 2010's Death from Above is just Royal Blood but good. And now I feel like because of this record I can't even say that anymore.
But that's it, right? But what that record showed me was A, this band, when it knows what they're doing, is incredible, and B, they don't have to do much to be incredible, and they're doing much of it here, and it's not quite working. But I will say that having heard 2 of the latest King Gizzard albums, where they are going through the motions, I would have Death from Above going through the motions any day. But the songs just aren't there. That's it, really.
I would simply rather not have either.
Yeah, there are at least tracks on here that I could listen to and be happy. They are not the majority of the record or near the majority of the record, but they're there.
And none of them are good as the worst track on You're a Woman and I'm a Machine. That album wholly and completely invalidates this one's existence. Like, utterly.
No, I would say that even just the very fucking last Death from Above record completely invalidates this one's existence. I'm sure you're correct. That at least felt fresh and awesome. It had some of their best songs on it. I'll go to bat for Nomad, especially, is one of the best songs they've ever put out.
Yes, I had myself muted, but I completely fucking agree with you about Nomad. Just a fucking rockin' tune.
Also, Nomad is just the best Royal Blood song.
They're like the better version of White Reaper.
Anyway, yeah, so this album's bad. I don't even think that it's just mediocre. I thought that the first few times I listened to it. I thought, there's a kernels of what I like about this band, suffused and terrible, muddy, ugly production. But every time I listen to this, I just fucking started. I mean, Zach said that he started hating, was it a particular song or is it maybe just the whole album as well? But I just started hating this whole fucking thing. One comparison that hasn't come up yet, that I'm surprised hasn't come up yet, because it was there's a particular artist that I think that, and don't shout if you know, because I'll get to it. There's a particular artist that I think the band are trying to ape on this record. In terms of the ways in which they attempt to branch out their sound, because you get plenty of that typical Death from Above bass riff yelling stuff, and then you get this other stuff on the record suffused into that, and a track like 1+1 is a perfect example because it kind of has both modes in it, where they're trying to ape this very specific band, and they're trying to sound like them, and they're trying to like expand their sound to resemble this band. And if you haven't cottoned on already, the band is the Strokes.
He sounds exactly like Casablancas towards the end of 1+1.
I thought that.
Yeah, but
I thought Casablancas, and I thought the period where the like post Radiohead prog and the sort of electronic stadium rock crossed over for Muse around Black Holes and Revelations a couple of times.
I would go more like even later Muse than that, but totally see what you mean. because Muse also came up a little bit in my mind as well. But I think that's more just a kind of a remnant of the Royal Blood comparison, which is a band that obviously themselves were heavily inspired by Muse. But anyway, yeah, this album is an album that is suffused with an identity crisis for the band. It feels like a record made out of obligation to make a record than a record made out of the desire to make one. It is a record that screams, we have no idea what to do with our sound at this point, and we are creatively sapped. I'm going to counterpoint slightly differently and say that I actually, despite this Strokesy and pastiche shit, I actually find the second half of this record slightly more tolerable than the first half, if only because when they slip into that Strokesian mode of being a bit kind of softer and more melodic with the tones, the absolutely oppressive production is less harmful than when they're trying to just be really fucking loud on the first half of the record and it sounds like butt. NYC Parallels.
Laura, gonna need you to isolate that clip for me.
NYC Parallels sounds like NYC Parallels is one of the most annoying songs of the year. And that hook fucking drives me crazy.
That's such a terrible fucking hook.
I am sent into a homicidal rage each time it's playing. I think it's the worst if you consider them both, especially the second part, but if you consider them both one song, I think it's the worst song they've ever made, my opinion. Free Animal is just stupid. What's the one after Parallels? Totally Wiped Out is probably just as bad, if not worse. A completely insufferable song. I agree that Glass Homes is not a very good song, but I at least appreciate this point in the record where they try to sound, even if it is a Strokesy and pastiche, they try to sound a little more dynamic at the very least, even if their production hampers it entirely. I think the closest thing to a good song on this record is Love Letter, which I actually think is pretty all right. It's a piano driven, again, very heavily Strokesy and ballad. It has a very similar dynamic tone to the songs on The New Abnormal. But I also think that it doesn't feel so much like pure ripoff, that it has no identity. I do think there are some synths that come in and color the song a little bit more as it goes on. Nothing amazing, not one of their best songs, but something of a bright spot by the time I get to it on the album. Mean Streets kind of continues in the same vein, but then it kind of gets really loud and fuzzy, and they try and do this kind of album climax with
Shout out to Robert De Niro.
They try and do this sort of album climax with this song. Oh God, yeah, but Robert De Niro.
No, I wasn't kidding. That happens.
No, I know.
It
took me a second to remember that it was a lyric.
They say Mean Streets like Robert De Niro, I think.
Yeah.
No. Log off, both of you.
It's really fucking
simply
at
do not.
Sebastian and not
yeah,
you.
it's just
as the lesser version of those two guys, Zach and I are appalled.
Offended. Listen. Let me ask you. Tyler, lean in. Let me ask you a question. Why would you listen to a Julian Casablancas pastiche when the Voids exists?
Exactly. I mean,
get the fuck out of here.
All of the most interesting parts of this album are just attempts at doing the new abnormal era Strokes. And that's a record I don't love, but this has given me a much more increased appreciation for how good it sounds in comparison. Holy fucking shit.
I suppose it's good for that.
Yeah, this is the worst produced album of the year so far, and one of the most obnoxious and certainly the most disappointing. I am at a loss for words. I really like in the same way that I've come to the Xiu Xiu record clicked for me this morning.
It's like anti-clicks.
This morning, this absolutely
Adam Sandler wept.
Plummeted in my estimation. I hate it.
Yeah,
it's bad. So I was really when you asked me to bat lead.
I would say you said it's worst produced record of the year. It is very badly produced, but I have listened to the latest Architects record, and boy, is that the worst produced record of the year that I've heard.
Yeah, I don't doubt that at all, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of badly produced disappointments, it's this, that, and Medicine at Midnight. And I'll give Medicine at Midnight credit. It's the best that I've heard of that group of records.
When you asked me to bat lead, I was a little concerned to do so because I knew that I had nothing nice left to say about it after listening to it a couple more times this morning. And I'm glad that there wasn't any dissent on that because this fucking blows.
Yeah,
like it sucks.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else have anything they want to add?
I've only just chimed in on the odd occasion. I haven't really spoken about it. I fucking loved 1+1 when it came out. And it is interesting to see in retrospect just how much a record can sour a single that you heard completely independently.
Facts. You're right.
Because it's just like it just the shittiness of the sound of this entire record points out how much of both how much of a lie that song is in retrospect as a lead single, and both how the seeds of how bad the rest of the record sounds are planted in it to begin with that I didn't see. This is an extraordinarily disappointing record. I was so jazzed for this, and it just sucks. Is all it is, really.
I'm gonna kick off. My favorite tracks are No, Go Fuck Yourself. And my least favorite track is NYC Power Elite Part 1 and 2. And I'm gonna drop 4 out of 10 on this bitch. Zach out.
Tyler.
Yeah, my favorite tracks are 1+1 and Love Letter. Least favorite track, NYC Power Elite Suite. And I give this record a 4.5 out of 10.
Yeah, so my favorite tracks are the ones that are universally agreed to be good. You know them. My least favorite tracks are those ones. You know them. And I'm giving this record a 5.5 out of 10.
Yeah, I'm gonna co-sign Saoirse's favorite and least favorites because I really can't. I could not be asked. 4 out of 10.
My favorite track is first one. My least favorite track is
The last one.
4 out of 10.
Okay.
More like is For Lovers indeed.
Hey.
Death from Above 1979 is 4 out of 10 lovers.
Death from my closet in which I will be swinging.
Death from Mike Shinoda. So that's a 4.7 out of 10. The only other album we have at a 4.7 out of 10 is Lamb of God self-titled.
That's about right.
A better album.
Yes.
Let's not get into
yes.
that debate.
Yeah, maybe that was too far.
That was an album that two of us rated real high and the others rated real low.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't call my 7 high, but
also coincidentally an album that references The Strokes, The New Abnormal.
Oh no.
Yeah, here's what I'll say about that is that they have the same average rating.
And what I'll say is when you're done here, I thoroughly encourage you, if you can bear it, to cleanse your ears by going and putting on the very first song on Outrageous Now, which is called Nomad, if you haven't heard it, which will absolutely make you put a big fat smile on your face.
And we'll tie into this year's Oscar nominations. There we go.
You know what's funny is this is just because how my brain works. Every time I think of that movie's title, I get the hook from Nomad by Death from Above 1979 stuck in my head. That's just who I am. Every single time. All right, so let us know in the
Wow.
comments.
Francis McDormand rolling down in the van.
Let
Let
us
us
know in
know.
the comments what your prediction for the Oscars are.
No, you cut that. Let us know in the comments what you think of the albums we talked about today, if you have thoughts. And let us know if you agree, disagree, were we too harsh on Death from Above 1979? We weren't. But if you think we were, then let us know. And yeah, just generally let us know in general what you think. Next week on the podcast, we are going to be covering two exciting new records. I think the new record from Godspeed You Black Emperor, Godspeed at State's End, and also very excitingly a new Armand Hammer record, which is the rap duo made up of Billy Woods and Elucid. They have collaborated with The Alchemist for an exciting new record called Harem, and that only leaves one thing left to say: rock over London, rock on Chicago, Wendy's, where's the beef?